You're live now?
I think so.
Okay. Uh, I think we met because I was asking you of like why you believe in God. It's kind of interesting. I don't think a lot of philosophers seem to believe in God. Do you think that's true or?
It sort of depends on um, which discipline. If it's like philosophies at large, there are some philosophers, but it's kind of a minority. Among philosophers of religion, though, those that specialize in the discipline that, among other things, studies arguments for and against God's existence, most of those either accept or lean towards theism.
See, and I wonder, like, is that because like they're more educated on the subject, so maybe that's why they're theist, or is it because they had like that disposition in the first place? I don't really know. I mean, I don't think that's. I think it's they had that disposition, but
I suspect they typically had the disposition to believe in God prior to doing it in the first place. That's my suspicion. I don't know for certain. I think that's true with a lot of cases. I think when you enter into philosophy, you find arguments that kind of comport with what you kind of already accept. So, kind of an
yeah.
example would be the Chinese room thought experiment. Can programs actually think?
Mhm.
If you run a program, can it think? Well, one argument in favor of it that running a program can't think is something called the Chinese room thought experiment. So here's kind of my own little modification of it. Imagine you're a person in a room, you receive Chinese symbols, and you translate those Chinese symbols to like binary code, and then you kind of do all the same mathematical and logical operations a computer does. And once you're done calculating, you convert the binary code back to Chinese characters and slip underneath the door. And now, unbeknownst to you, the person who is sending you questions in Chinese and you're giving back answers, and you're perfectly mimicking somebody who can understand Chinese.
Mhm.
Now, that would seem to indicate that just running a program isn't really going to be enough to understand Chinese. Um, but some people have the intuition that, well, if you're actually doing all that, this process of converting the Chinese characters to binary code, running the calculations, that actually generates a consciousness that understands Chinese, that generates a consciousness that understands Chinese. And now for me, that's like, well, that seems pretty wacky. It seems more like sorcery than science. But there are people whose intuitive perceptions differ on that. And so I think even though that argument seems really convincing to me, it might be that that's kind of where my intuition lies. I kind of have those intuitive perceptions. But we can get more analytical here with.
I've heard of the that Chinese thought experiment, and I think like what I've come to think about it is that like that human in that example, like does he understand Chinese? He doesn't understand the meaning of the symbols, right? But he probably understands the syntax, right? Like the symbols and like the form of the symbols, the location of the symbols. But then where the analogy or the thought experiment breaks down for me is that we're using a human, right? And we know humans understand syntax, but maybe like AI is not like that, you know?
Well, the idea is that just running a program isn't going to be enough. Now, John R. Searle was actually a physicalist. He believed that brains are purely physical beings, but he just thought that running a program wouldn't be enough. So here I have an example where a program is actually being run, and yet if there's no consciousness that's generated to understand Chinese, then it's clear that just running a program will by itself not be enough.
And that's the thing. Maybe we could get into this later. Uh, this is how we define like how do we define words? Because like physical, there's like a broad definition for physical, right? The broad definition for physical is anything we can interact with somehow. That's like the broad definition of physical. I think that's the one like physicists use, right? And under this broad definition of like physical, uh, even psychology is physical. But then I think what most people they use physical versus mental. They're like they use it to like differentiate the world out there from the world in here. You know what I'm saying?
Um, I think that's not physical doesn't mean quite what we interact with, but something more along the lines of, maybe we can point to examples, and hope for the best. Like, okay, like facts of physics and chemistry, that type of realm that science studies, that's what we consider physical, like space, time, matter, and energy, that sort of thing. Anyway, I'd like
Mind.
to get into a little bit of my epistemology with concrete cases about reasons why I believe God exists.
Sure, but real quick, do you think scientists do not study the mind?
Well, they do.
Yeah.
Psychology is a science that studies the mind,
Mhm.
and there's neuroscience, which studies the physical structure of the brain.
and also like the properties of the brain, which I think it's what we would call the mind.
Well, that opens up a can of worms, philosophy of mind, which I don't want to get into quite yet.
Sure, sure, sure.
All right, but anyway, let's to briefly kind of introduce some why I believe in God. All right, so why I believe in God, a little bit of it anyway. Why anyway? So starting with a little bit of logic and epistemology in philosophy, intuition refers to what the consciousness immediately apprehends and what is directly present to one's consciousness. So examples include sensory experience and various intuitive perceptions, like a person mentally seeing that 1 plus 1 equals 2. So other examples include the intuition that the external world is real and the moral intuition that there is something morally wrong with torturing innocent sentient life as infants just for fun. So in logic, a valid argument is where it's impossible to have two premises and a false conclusion. And a sound argument is illogically valid with all two premises. Somebody introducing some valid arguments, whether they're sound, that is, whether they have all those premises are true, is going to be more controversial. So because of time, I'm just going to introduce these two arguments here. One is from the argument of applicability of mathematics, and two is a version of the moral argument. Now, there are two conceivable universes. One is like a randomized hard drive universe, a universe akin to a randomized hard drive. That's a chaotic, jumbled mess, disorderly, unpredictable behavior at every moment. But there's another type of conceivable universe that we could call a software universe. This is a universe akin to a complex computer program with sophisticated mathematical algorithms directing behavior. So it's a universe with consistent mathematical patterns, ubiquitously imprinted into nature via physical laws, such that it makes physics almost ludicrously successful in precisely predicting behavior. So examples include relativity and quantum mechanics. So the physical laws are akin to a program's mathematical algorithms that behavior is directed in an orderly and predictable fashion. Now, to give an illustration of what I mean by this, here's an example of an algorithm that our universe has, one for kinetic energy, but that's pretty complicated. So let's have this simpler one that velocity is well below the speed of light. This is a pretty darn good approximation. So this is kind of, we have this equation. We plug in the mass, plug in the velocity, and we get the kinetic energy. Kind of nice, neat, orderly way. But we can conceive the universe behaving very differently like this, where the values are just kind of all over the place, and the rules for what the kinetic energy is for the mass given a velocity are just changed from moment to moment. Not only do they have like chaotic matter, changes from moment to moment. So that's a different way the universe could conceivably have been like. And our universe is not a randomized hard drive universe. We've empirically discovered that's a lot more like a software universe. So more concrete examples, scientists have used the algorithmic structure of the universe to locate a previously undiscovered planet, Neptune, via calculation. We didn't see it initially. We just kind of run some calculations, and it's like, okay, it should be here. And we're pretty darn close. We're off by like 1 degree or so. Another example is scientists have used math to predict the Higgs boson particle, which was found after exerting millions of work hours and billions of dollars. Now, to quote Eugene Wigner, the reasonable effectiveness of mathematics and natural sciences, it is, as Schrodinger remarked, a miracle that in spite of the baffling complexity of the world, certain regularities in the events could be discovered. One such regularity, discovered by Galileo, is that two rocks dropped at the same time from the same height reached the ground at the same time. The laws of nature are concerned with such regularities. And as Albert Einstein described it, you find it in a letter to Marie Solovine, you find it strange that I consider the comprehensibility of the world, to the extent they were authorized to speak of such a comprehensibility, as a miracle or as an eternal mystery. Well, a priori, one should expect a chaotic world which cannot be grasped by the mind in any way. One could, yes, one should expect the world to be subjected to law only to the extent that we order it through our intelligence. Ordering of this kind would be like the alphabetical ordering of the words of language. By contrast, the kind of order created by Newton's theory of gravitation, for instance, is wholly different. Any of the axioms of the theory proposed by man, the success of such a project presupposes a high degree of ordering of the objective world. This could not be expected a priori. That is the miracle which is constantly being reinforced as our knowledge expands. So notice that part here. A priori, one should expect a chaotic world. So that's more like that randomized hard drive universe I mentioned earlier. When we don't live in a randomized hard drive, we live in that software universe. So why is it
real quick, can you repeat that again? Like what we should expect a priori?
So as Einstein put it, a priori one should expect a chaotic world, which cannot be the grasp of the mind in any way, a more chaotic world. And that's that randomized hard drive universe I mentioned earlier.
Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you, but I'm just taking notes.
Okay.
Why? I'm not going to interrupt you a lot. I'm sorry. Why is it? Why should we expect a priori that the universe should be chaotic?
Well, think of when we randomize a hard drive, ones and zeros sped. If we randomize a hard drive, ones and zeros, what is the most likely outcome to expect? Well, the most likely outcome to expect is the ones and zeros are set sporadically with no meaningful pattern. There are more ways for things to be different than there are to be the same. It's kind of an oversimplified way of putting it.
What would chaotic mean here? Like,
Well, that would be that illustration I mentioned earlier. You know that equation for kinetic energy and mass and velocity?
mhm.
So there we have this algorithm that's imprinted in the universe that has that. But we could just imagine something more chaotic for that. Like instead of like an equation, just like some random speckled of dots on a graph, like I mentioned earlier. Or something that even more chaotic and that it changes from moment to moment. So we just like randomly threw dots everywhere as far as values, we get, kind of a chaotic result. It wouldn't be have this orderly, predictable fashion. But instead, we find something more like a software universe.
Gotcha. And you were saying earlier that when it comes to quantum physics, maybe there is some randomness, right?
Well, there may be some degree of randomness in one sense, but also quantum mechanics is given really, really precise predictions. We can do science like crazy there, and like I mentioned, we use math predicts the Higgs boson particle. We used math using the algorithmic structure of the universe to find Neptune, previously undiscovered planet. So, I mean,
Yeah.
and whether there's actual real randomness in quantum mechanics is also a disputed notion that we don't need to get into here.
Yeah. And I'm not
Uh,
educated enough, and I don't think that maybe you would be either, and I wouldn't expect you to. But I do suspect that what we see as randomness is actually not even randomness. I think it's just lack of information for us. But that's my intuition.
yeah, it's disputed, and we didn't yet bother us from here. But anyway, yeah, like I mentioned, we live in a software universe rather than a randomized hard drive universe. So why is it a software universe? So conceivably, the scientific use of math, like finding Neptune and predicting the Higgs boson, didn't have to be nearly as stunningly effective as we observe. So why is it? Well, for theists, the answer is simple. We live in a software universe that allows physics to be almost ludicrously successful in making accurate and precise predictions because the universe was designed. Now, for the atheists, really the only viable option is for why we live in a software universe instead of randomized hard drive universe. It's just a fantastic, happy coincidence. But a happy coincidence of this magnitude strikes some people as too coincidental to be very plausible. So here's one argument one could make. If God does not exist, then the applicability of mathematics, that is, the universe being more like a software universe rather than a randomized hard drive universe, is just a happy coincidence. The applicability of mathematics is not just a happy coincidence, and therefore God exists. So here's one objection one could make to that.
And
Uh,
wait, just real quick, let me see if I can make an objection. When you mean coincidence, do you mean it happens for no reason or it happens for a different reason than what you thought?
I'm actually going to get into that later on.
Oh, okay, sure. Go ahead. Sorry.
Okay. So here's one objection one could make. The argument assumes that the software universe is metaphysically contingent, that the universe could have been different, but perhaps the software-like ordering is metaphysically necessary and would have obtained even without a designer. Now, our response to this is that this type of objection proves too much. To illustrate, consider what you can call a fine-tuned asteroid shower scenario. Suppose there's an asteroid shower that hits the moon to spell out there is the cosmic designer, has supernaturally fine-tuned certain parameters so that this message would appear. Now, suppose we discover that yes, indeed, if certain initial parameters of the early universe were altered even slightly, no asteroid shower text would appear. Now, imagine someone says, well, this isn't evidence for a designer because perhaps those initial parameters were metaphysically necessary. Well, clearly this rebuttal doesn't work. But why doesn't it work? Well, in addition to physical or metaphysical probability, there's also epistemic probability, probably having to do with evidential relations. So given atheism, it is epistemically improbable there would be a metaphysical necessity of fine-tuned parameters resulting in the asteroid shower text. After all, it's just as easy to conceive a metaphysical necessity where the parameters fall outside that narrow fine-tuned range. So one way to look at it is that surprising on atheism that we would see this asteroid shower text. So the application for this is that maybe it's metaphysically necessary. Objection proves too much. Clearly, it won't work in the fine-tuned asteroid shower scenario because the real issue is epistemic probability. The explanandum, that is the thing to be explained, is nonetheless surprising on atheism. So for the software universe, there's what we could call an epistemic coincidence. Atheism gives us no a priori reason to expect a software universe. So epistemically speaking, it would be a happy coincidence that we live in a software universe if atheism is true. And that's kind of what I mean by happy coincidence. It's
Gotcha.
like,
So you're saying that you would expect the universe to be chaotic
well,
if
at the
it
very
if it
least,
had no conscious creator or something like that, right?
well, if God does not exist, if the universe weren't designed, it's like, wow, we're
Mhm.
really, really lucky that there's this algorithmic structure imprinted in the universe. Conceivably, it didn't have to be this way. So, wow, we got really lucky. Atheism by itself gives us really no a priori reason to expect a software universe rather than a randomized hard drive universe. It would be as if, ones and zeros are assigned sporadically, randomly, and by sheer chance, Oh, we got a program out of that. Well, that's lucky, unexpected. So
Gotcha. Yeah, I don't want to really interrupt you too much, so I'll let you go. But once we get through the arguments, I think we do have to eventually go through epistemology because a lot of these arguments are resting on like intuitions, and I just
yeah,
don't share those intuitions. So then we could get a little deeper into like, well, what justifies those intuitions, right? But sorry, go ahead.
okay. So here's the escape hatch for an atheist who wants to reject that argument. Now, if I were an atheist, I believe the fact that we live in a software universe as opposed to a randomized hard drive universe is a happy coincidence. Then I could see that it's non-zero evidence in favor of design, but I also say its evidential value is small or at least insufficient. So I think that's a good escape hatch, or at least not a terrible one. You have to remember that just because a belief is true doesn't mean that all the evidence is completely one-sided in favor of it. So I could take this stance comfortably as an atheist, more or less. But my thoughts is that the universe is software-like order seems like significant evidence for design to me, but your mileage may vary. People can have different intuitive perceptions about this. So that's the argument from the applicability of mathematics. Basically, our universe being a software universe instead of a randomized hard drive universe is evidence for design. So lastly, I'll just go to the moral argument. So to do that, I think it's important to define what our moral semantics is, what we mean by reality. So moral semantics is how we define moral terminology. And moral obligations have an ought component for them. For example, an action is morally wrong for someone if they ought not to do it. But what type of ought are we using here? Because we actually use words like ought and should in a couple different ways. So here's one way, and what we call hypothetical ought or conditional ought. And that takes the form of something sufficiently like if you want G, you ought to do A, and says that some possible action is practically necessary for a particular goal, without saying whether one should aim for that goal in the first place. So an example would be when, if you want to do well in school, you ought to study just means something like, as a matter of practical necessity, you need to study to do well in school. Now, while the hypothetical ought is in one sense prescriptive, it's also purely descriptive because this ought is a shorthand for some purely descriptive meaning. That is, that the particular action is practically necessary to accomplish the stated goal. Now, there's another type of ought which we can call a Hume ought that prescribes in a way that is not purely descriptive. So one example is like, you should not torture infants just for fun, might be using someone saying that might have this type of ought in mind. So it's a type of ought that does not have only descriptive qualities. I call it the Hume ought after Scottish philosopher David Hume. He seems to have had this ought in mind for his famous is-ought distinction. And notably, he specifically had the moral ought in mind. So the moral ought, as I'm using here, is a Hume ought. That is, it is false that the moral ought has only descriptive qualities. So for example, an action is morally obligatory only if someone ought to do it in that Humean ought sense. So as a wording, some non-theists have a moral semantics where moral oughts are purely descriptive. That's why I go through all the trouble for defining my terms, because I find that sometimes atheists and theists talk past each other when discussing morality. So that has important implications, and here's why. Imagine a moral nihilist, a moral realist observes some jerk kicking a dog just for fun. The dog whimpers in pain and runs away. Now imagine we have a moral nihilist who does not believe in morality and a moral realist who does believe in morality, moral wrongness. They all agree on the same physiological and psychological facts. That is, the dog felt pain and suffered minor injury. Now, the moral nihilist, who does not believe in moral wrongness, says, well, I don't think moral wrongness is attached to that action. Moral realist says, well, I think moral wrongness is attached to that action. There is no empirical way to determine who is right, because both views, moral nihilism and moral realism, are empirically identical. It's because moral wrongness on the Humean moral semantics is non-physical. It's a non-natural property. So we can have a quick argument for that. All natural facts, that is, facts of chemistry and physics and so forth, are purely descriptive. Deontic moral facts, facts that we morally should and shouldn't do, are not purely descriptive on the Humean ought moral semantics. And so therefore, deontic moral facts are non-natural. That leads us to one version of the moral argument.
Sorry, just real quick, just to clarify. When you're saying natural, what do you mean by natural?
So those are natural facts or facts of physics, chemistry, and so forth.
Okay, so that's how you define. So this is how I was saying, like, there's different definitions for words. Like, one definition for natural is literally just reality, right? But I think how people normally use natural is to differentiate between artificial and natural, right? Natural would be like made without a consciousness or without human consciousness, and then artificial would be made with consciousness or made with human consciousness.
I mean, that's one sense of it, but there's people can use natural in the sense of natural versus artificial, but they can also use natural in the sense of natural versus supernatural or natural versus non-natural. Here I'm using it.
Sorry, real quick. It would be hard to define supernatural if you have not defined natural in the first place. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so natural facts, I mean the facts of physics, chemistry, and so forth. That's what I mean by a natural fact.
And here's the thing. Here's the way I think you're using it. So there's another way to use it, and it's natural versus social, right? So we say the physical sciences or the natural sciences, and then we say the social sciences, right? So I think that's what you're using. You're saying physics, chemistry. Maybe you could even say biology, but then we're talking about psychology or sociology. Maybe that's more social. Sorry,
Well,
go
that's
ahead.
not quite what I'm using here. To for sake of time, I've simplified a lot. So I have like a more scholarly paper that goes into this more detail, and where I define facts of any fact can be described entirely in the language of the natural psychology and the natural sciences. So in the paper that I wrote, that's how I describe natural. So it'd cover facts of psychology as well, descriptive facts of psychology anyway. But I kind of like simplified that because some naturalists believe that psychological facts are reducible to physical facts anyway. But I kind of like ignoring that here for sake of because I just want to simplify things. I
Just
don't
so
want
I
to get
understand. So sorry to understand. What does not natural mean? Can you give me an example just so I could like wrap my head around it a little bit?
well, if deities existed, they presumably be non-natural. Ghosts, if they existed, would be non-natural. Platonic objects, if they existed, they would be non-natural. So basically,
I
any fact that can't be described entirely in language of psychology, the natural sciences, would be non. Any fact that cannot be stated entirely in language of psychology, the natural sciences, would be non-natural in the sense that I'm using here. So that would include
yeah.
Platonism.
I don't even know how that's like possible. Like if a ghost existed in the real world, I would call that natural. But again, that's because it depends what you mean by natural. Because for me, natural, like in the broadest sense, it just means reality. You know?
Well, that would be a
Uh,
rather idiosyncratic definition of natural, but in this context, I'm referring to facts that can be stated entirely in language of the natural sciences and psychology.
have you heard of theists that try to like? There's a distinction between natural and supernatural, and I've heard theists say that that's not a good distinction. That it's all the same thing. Have you
There
heard
are
theists?
some, but I think like we have like at least a rough idea of what facts of chemistry and physics and biology are, and what descriptive facts of psychology are. And we could just do like, okay, any fact that doesn't really fit into these categories of study, we can say are non-natural. That could be useful in certain conditions. Anyway, moving
I'll
along.
I'll let you go, but just real quick, just so you can understand my confusion. Like if ghosts only existed in your mind, if they were only subjectively true, I would say that's like a psychological study, right?
Well, that's not what I mean by ghosts. I mean like incorporeal spirits.
Right. And if they existed that way, like if they were concrete, like they also existed in the real world, I would say that's like a fact of physics, or at whatever level they are. But
Well, because they wouldn't have mass, they wouldn't have volume in the ordinary sense of the term.
well,
That's kind of what the ordinary conception of ghosts is that they're incorporeal.
I don't think light has mass either.
Yeah, but they're still physical.
Well,
They consist of energy.
I'm sorry, I don't want to like take up too much of your time, but like physicists, I think use a broad sense of uh, physical. Like if we interact with it somehow, they call it physical. I think that's the one they use.
Well, they use like physics has to do with space, time, matter, and energy. Broadly, that's really what it studies. So energy would be part of physics. Space time would be part of physics. But anyway, we can discuss this later. At least hopefully you have at least a rough idea of what I mean by natural. This
Sure,
that
sure.
realm that
Sorry,
physics, chemistry, and so forth.
I'll be more quiet. Sorry, sorry, sorry.
All right. So here's the moral argument. At least one version of it. If God does not exist, then nothing is morally wrong. Some things are morally wrong, and therefore God exists. Now, if the justification for premise two is relatively easy, just find a good example of something that's morally wrong. Um, it's mostly controversial that it's wrong to torture if it's just for fun. There are some people who disagree, but most people agree that this isn't a good example, that example that works. So what about that first premise here? Well, the first premise doesn't say that God is necessary for morality. It doesn't say that moral wrongness can't exist without God. It says that morality doesn't exist without God. So that's an important clarification. To show that premise one is probably true, it suffices to show that moral wrongness probably doesn't exist given God's non-existence. And because it's a theorem, at given A, probably C entails probably if A, then C. So thus, God's non-existence, it is likely that nothing is morally wrong. It entails that premise one is at least probably true. If need be, we can go to the math involved. I have that on my blog. So, as before, given God's non-existence, it is likely that moral wrongness doesn't exist. The general approach that I use is like assume arguendo, that is for sake of argument, that atheism is true. And for atheists, this will be easy. And see that leads to moral wrongness probably not existing. So why might an atheist accept premise one? Well, an atheist might reason like this. Moral wrongness is very strange. It's invisible, non-physical, and empirically undetectable. So why shouldn't I, the atheist, reject the existence of this invisible, non-physical thing that cannot be empirically detected. If I'm to reject the existence of invisible, non-physical deities that have been empirically detected. So given atheism seems more likely that people's belief in world wrongness is a delusion brought about by evolution to get us to behave in certain ways and help our species survive. So given atheism, world wrongness probably doesn't exist. And so an atheist who believes that given God's not existence, it is likely that world wrongness doesn't exist is rationally committed to believing that premise one is probably true. And basically any atheist who denies premise two, that is, anyone who doesn't believe that God does not exist and world wrongness does not exist, is rationally committed to believing, given God's not existence, world wrongness doesn't exist, and would thus be rationally committed to accepting premise one. So basically what that means is that if an atheist who denies the second premise, believes God does not exist and world wrongness does not exist, is ultimately rationally committed to accepting the first premise. So I've seen atheists say, well, I believe both premises are false. Well, that doesn't really work.
Let me see the premise. So if God does not exist, then moral wrongs do not exist. Moral wrongs do not exist. Therefore, so you're saying if you accept one, you must accept both, right?
Well, if you accept that, if you're an atheist, if you believe that God does not exist and moral wrongness does not exist, then that rationally commits you to believing that given God's not existence, moral wrongness probably doesn't exist. And that, in turn, would rationally commit you to accept premise one. So I have this to kind of prove it if need be. We can go into the mathematical details, but that's kind of what it works.
But what if you, so go back to the argument? Yeah. So moral wrongness does not exist. I do think moral wrongs do exist, but I just don't think God doesn't exist.
That was a mistake. Okay, so moving on. So there is an escape hatch for the atheist. If I were an atheist, here's what I would believe. Only conditional odds obtain moral wrongness in the ordinary sentence of the term doesn't exist. So my thoughts is that I don't think it's reasonable to believe that there's nothing morally wrong with torturing if it's just for fun. While some atheists are more willing to believe that there's nothing morally wrong with torturing if it's just for fun, they are willing to believe that atheism is false. That doesn't seem rational to me. And by my lights, any ideology that says it's not morally wrong to torture if it's just for fun is probably false. I mean, if my religion taught that, I would have been in that religion. And so that's the moral argument in a nutshell. Like, given God's not existence, it isn't likely that moral wrongness exists, yet moral wrongness does exist. For example, it's morally wrong to torture infants just for fun. Now, one of the reasons why I brought up intuition is we can have these contrasting worldviews. Many people intuitively sense the non-natural realm. So not necessarily with God directly, there's also morality, which is non-natural. And just as we intuitively sense the external world, many people intuitively sense that there's something morally wrong with torturing if it's just for fun. Now, some people apparently don't sense it. Now, moral nihilists, those who don't believe anything is morally wrong, they can be nice people and can be as opposed to such torture as much as the next person. It's just that if they're consistent, they have to admit their intense dislike of such torture is just a matter of personal taste. There's nothing really wrong with it. Because the moment they do believe people shouldn't torture infants, they're believing morality. And so why some people are theists and why some people are atheists, and this might not apply to you, but this is why some are atheists and some are atheists, is this. Some people just have differing intuitive perceptions. And that's kind of like a rough introduction to my epistemology. Let's see if I can stop sharing here. Okay, and we're back. So yeah, that gives a rough introduction in my epistemology and practice. So you mentioned, do you believe in moral wrongness in that Humean odd sense, a kind that would be non-natural, at least in the sense that doesn't really fit the realm of physics, chemistry, and so forth?
I'm sorry, I was just taking some notes. I'm so sorry. Can you repeat what you just said?
Okay, I was wondering, so if we use the Humean ought moral semantics, do you believe in that sort of morality, which would entail that moral wrongness is non-natural, at least in the sense of not fitting the... I mean, we can't empirically detect it, for example. It's not part of physics, chemistry.
I disagree, actually. So I think you can empirically detect it, right? So
well, think about like an example of the moral nihilist and the moral realist. The moral nihilist says, I don't think moral wrongness is associated with that property. It's associated with that action. And the moral realist says, I think moral wrongness is associated with that action. These two views are empirically indistinguishable from each other. They agree on all the same physiological and psychological facts.
Oh, I know, but it just depends what you define as moral, right? So, like, we create the words, and we get to define words, and you can say, "Oh, that's not what I mean." You know, when I say this word, I mean this, right? So, words are just labels to point at things in reality.
Yeah, that's why I defined my moral terms. If we use the Humean not moral semantics I described, in which case the moral nihilist views and the moral realist views are empirically indistinguishable from each other. Using that moral semantics.
Oh, I don't use that semantics, but sorry.
Yeah, and that's why I defined my terms initially, is because I think a lot of times atheists and theists can talk past each other when it comes to whether morality exists. I've had that happen like many, many times. I remember one time one of my first debates on YouTube was like, okay, is that first premise true? Like William Lane Craig, a Christian philosopher, he has a slightly different version. Like if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. Like, and the debate was supposed to be on the first premise, and it turns out we actually kind of agreed on the first premise all along. He was actually committed to accepting the first premise at least because he just defined morality. I mean, if you use like the conditional ought, like I mentioned earlier, where the moral ought just has a purely descriptive meaning. Well, yeah, you can have morality. I mean, that first premise isn't going to be convincing at all if you use that conditional ought. But when theists use the moral argument, they're using that human moral ought. They're using that type of ought that does not have only descriptive qualities. And that leads to, as I mentioned before, moral wrongness being non-natural.
Right. So by prescriptive, you're saying what we should do, right? And descriptive is just what is, right?
Yeah, kind of. So that in one sense, the conditional ought or hypothetical ought, there is in one sense that it's prescriptive, but there's also another sense in which it's purely descriptive because it has a purely descriptive meaning. You can restate this ought in purely descriptive terms and have it be synonymous.
Yeah. Well, I
Whereas,
think so. I think you can breach the gap between like the is and ought gap with your moral axioms. So one moral axiom is just you define morality. Like morality is decreasing suffering, or I mean you could go like ontology, like just have moral rules in your axioms, or you can have like utilitarianism, although that can get kind of frisky. But you can have your moral axioms, your rules or whatever, and then like the last axiom can be you should do what is moral, and then there you have prescriptive moral axioms.
well, you can give like the moral ought an entirely descriptive meaning. You could just say what is morally wrong. By what I mean by morally wrong is something like that which decreases suffering. You could say that's the definition. I'll give my definition of moral wrongness an entirely descriptive meaning. You can do that, but when people talk about morality, they have in mind the human ought, that type of ought that does not have only descriptive qualities. They're not using the descriptive ought. Now, if you use the conditional ought, you could say, if you want, this, you do that. Describe actions that are practical necessity, or give some other type of descriptive meaning. But then you don't really have morality in the ordinary sense of the term. The ordinary sense of the term uses the human ought. That's why we have that is ought problem.
Gotcha. Here, I just want to make sure that you're understanding what I'm saying. So, like, we have a moral system, right? And then the moral axioms are the building blocks for that system, right? And your moral axioms, you could fill those up with rules, whatever they are. And I'm just
So
saying,
give a specific of example of what do you mean by a moral axiom? Just so we're on the same page.
sure. I mean, um, I'm still working on morality right now. I have not gotten all my thoughts, but I mean, I could just give you an example. Like, let's go biblical. Thou shalt not murder, right?
Okay, now what do you mean by ought in that sentence? Are you using
Ought.
a human ought or are you using a
Oh,
conditional ought?
I'm using a descriptive. Is that Humean or what is that?
One that would be purely descriptive would not be Hume. Hume seems to be using that type of ought that does not have only descriptive qualities. He's the guy that's famous for that is ought problem.
Gotcha, gotcha, gotcha. So it would just purely be descriptive. It would not be prescriptive. Uh, how you make it prescriptive is to, once you have your moral axioms, your moral rules or whatever, at the end, you add another axiom. And that moral axiom would say something like, uh, do what is moral. And then there you go.
Well, that's not really an axiom. It's more like a command. So axioms are like truth apps. They're like true or false.
Oh, okay. So maybe we should get deeper into epistemology. I don't think axioms are, I don't think you could, I think I see axioms as foundational assumptions.
Yeah,
I
that's
don't
what I
see them
mean. But
as,
assumptions are like statements that are true or false.
yeah, yeah.
So when you say do this, that's not a proposition. That's not something that it's true or false. Now
Do what is moral.
you can have like a prescription like a hype. So here's what you could do. You could say we have these agreed upon goals,
Mhm.
and here are things that are practically necessary to achieve that goal. And so we can say that the moral ought are these hypothetical oughts. These hypothetical oughts are linked to goals that we all want to achieve. So ultimately, it's descriptive. Um, and ultimately descriptive. It's reducible to entirely descriptive, but in another sense, it's prescriptive because there are these things that we want to do. You can do that. The problem is if you don't have that ought in that Humean sense,
Mhm.
you're not really talking about morality in the ordinary sense of the term.
No, I'm saying you. I'm saying you have a moral axiom, like a foundational assumption, and you should slip the ought in there. Uh, like
Yeah, but if
do. Sorry, go ahead.
yeah, but okay. So if it does this ought have an entirely descriptive meaning?
The understanding.
Okay, you remember what the hypothetical ought is?
Yes. Do something if you want something done, right? Like
Yeah, if you
if
want
you.
X, you ought to do Y.
Yeah, yeah.
And the ought just means like an example would be like if you want to do well in school, you ought to study. Just means something like as a matter of practical necessity, you need to study to do well in school. It's a shorthand for some purely descriptive meaning, namely that this possible action is practically necessary to achieve some particular goal.
Let me tell you how I view morality. Have you heard of Sam Harris's Moral Landscape?
Yeah, I read his book.
So, right, right. So there's some things that are probably more or less moral, and then there's some things that are just equivalent. Equivalent. They're kind of like the same. You know, like if somebody's thirsty, you could give them water, you could give them soda, you could give them coffee, and those would all be moral. But if you give somebody battery acid, clearly not moral, right?
As I recall, Sam Harris assigns a purely descriptive meaning to his moral oughts, like in terms of like the well-being of conscious creatures. And you can construct hypothetical oughts around that and call that morality.
Mhm.
Is that what you have in mind?
Yeah, but I don't know what prevents me from uh, putting in ought as a moral axiom. I don't know what prevents me from doing that.
I mean, you can do that. I mean, it's just we have to like make it clear. Okay, as a moral axiom, what do you mean? Is it like are you
Prescriptive,
okay? Prescriptive, yes, but does this ought have a purely descriptive meaning, like in like a hypothetical ought?
purely prescriptive.
No, I said does it have an entire? Is it reducible to an entirely descriptive meaning, like a hypothetical ought?
Oh, got you, got you, got you, got you. No, it would be prescriptive. So that's how you would connect. How would you connect the is and the ought? You would just make an axiom for it. It would connect it. And then you could ask, well, how could you prove that? And then it's like, well, it's just a foundational assumption. It's just a
Okay,
starting
so if
point.
it's an axiom,
Hmm.
okay, if you're just okay, so are you using? So is it that type of ought that is not does not have only descriptive qualities? I mean, you can make an assumption and say, I assume, for example, that it's wrong to harm innocent sentient creatures. You could do that, but okay, is this a hypothetical ought or is it a human ought? Now, if it's a human ought, then we're still at that problem where it's going to be non-natural because, like in the moral nihilist and the moral realist,
Uh-huh.
those views are empirically indistinguishable from each other. It's going to be empirically undetectable because the human ought is ultimately non-natural.
I so I think you can. So like I'm thinking of like various distinctions. So like there's a distinction between abstracts and concretes. Like for me, an abstract is something that's true in your head, and a concrete is something that's true out here in the real world, right? And then we concretes or abstracts. They can be objects or the property of objects, right? And I see things like morality as a property of objects. So I don't think they're not. I view them as concretes. It's like I mean, you can't have them without the object, right? You cannot have the driving without the vehicle, right?
Okay, yeah, yeah. Properties can have objects like a ball, for example, can have the property of redness. This is a red ball, but
Yeah.
nonetheless, the redness of the ball is a property that's empirically detectable. We can see it. Whereas in contrast, the moral nihilist and moral realist views they're empirically indistinguishable. You can't empirically distinguish them. They agree on all the same observable facts, all the same observable and psychological facts.
No, I think you can see them. I mean, it's like I'll give you an
Well,
example.
how
It's
would
like
you distinguish what empirical fact would distinguish between the moral nihilist and moral realist views in the dog kicker scenario, for example, when it seems they agree on all the same physiological and psychological facts involved.
so I mean, you would go with the definition. So you would be like again, just very quick definition. I have not worked this out completely, but it would be like decreased suffering or something like that, right?
Okay, so you define moral wrongness as decreased suffering.
Sorry, repeat that again.
So defining moral wrongness as decreasing suffering.
Yeah.
Okay, well then we're back at okay, that would be using the moral ought in a purely descriptive way. That would imbue a descriptive meaning in moral wrongness, which is not the moral semantics I'm using with respect to the moral argument. I'm using the human ought, the type of ought that is not have only descriptive qualities.
Yeah, I know, and I don't know why a moral axiom couldn't bridge that gap. Like do
You
what is
could
moral.
give a purely descriptive meaning to deontic moral terms. You could say, well, by moral wrongness, I just mean decreasing suffering. You can say that that's what I mean by moral wrongness. It's just that that's not what the argument means by moral wrongness, and that's
No,
not what.
it's not. Sorry, it's not just like this is what I mean by moral. Like here's my moral system, but so like my moral system has moral axioms that determine if something is moral or not. But then there's like an additional axiom that it's like do what is moral, and that's just an axiom. It's just
Well,
a
that's not
foundational
an axiom.
assumption.
That's an imperative.
What do you mean
Axioms are
imperative?
things that are true or false. Now, you could have as an axiom as we ought to be moral. That would be
I,
making a truth claim.
why? I mean, do what is moral. I see what you're saying. I see what you're saying now. It's not a proposition. Okay. I don't know if it has to be a proposition. Why does it have to be a proposition?
Well, that's what an axiom is. An axiom is like an assumption. An assumption is a proposition. It's something that's true or false. Like I believe X to be true. You can't say I believe do what is moral to be true. I could believe we ought to be moral is true, but do what is moral is not a proposition.
Yeah, and
Axioms are propositions.
then I guess I can. Yeah, I guess I would just add that axiom even if it's not a proposition. I guess that's how you breach the gap.
Well,
Let,
the
let, let,
axiom.
sorry, let me just ask, just for it to be fair, how would you breach the gap, that is ought gap with God? I'm curious just to see.
Well, in a way, I don't think you really can. I think if something is reducible can't be reduced entirely descriptive qualities, you can't really bridge it. I mean, by definition, a human ought is a type of ought that does not have only descriptive qualities. So, but maybe you're really asking, it's like, okay, well, how would God ground morality? Well, I would say that God does not have.
Prescriptively, not descriptively, like prescriptively.
So how I would, I'm not sure I understand how would God ground it prescriptively. I can take a stab at it. How I would, if I were to use God to ground morality, I could say God as an essential property has this ought to be obeyed quality to him, and because God has this ought to be obeyed quality to him, then he can like impose moral obligations. But you couldn't really ground the moral ought in terms of purely descriptive. It is not that. It's not the case that it has only descriptive qualities. It has to have at least some, irreducibly prescriptive qualities. Something it doesn't reduce to the purely descriptive.
Okay, so uh, so you're not even sure how God can make morality prescriptive?
Well, I think he kind of does like as a more or less more or less like
Brutal
in a brute
fact.
fact that he has this ought to be obeyed quality to him, and that's just like there's no further explanation for why that's the case.
Got you. Why can't we do that with uh, a moral axiom that just does that? Like it's just a brutal fact that you should do what's moral. And it's like it's not a proposition. So what? I don't understand why that stops it.
Well, it would axioms by definitions would have to be propositions. Now you could get now what an atheist could do is say, I think moral wrongness exists just as a brute fact that the when kicking a dog just for fun, I mean that's morally wrong, and there's no further ontological explanation for why this non-natural property is associated with that action. So that's an option an atheist could take.
Hmm.
Now, but I think on atheism, it is unlikely that this non-natural property exists. Now, why would I think that? Well, there are a couple of reasons why. One is that it doesn't seem, in the absence of God or something supernatural, it doesn't seem like we know that moral wrongness exists. Like I mentioned before, we can't empirically detect it. And then you could say, well, okay, how is it that we came by these moral beliefs? Well, you could say, well, sociobiological evolution gave us these intuitions that this non-natural moral wrongness exists, but that doesn't really seem sufficient. Like, suppose, for example, as a result of a mutation, through evolution, gave the mutation that an invisible dragon is in my garage right now. It's empirically
Hmm.
undetectable invisible dragon. Now, even if that belief is true, it doesn't seem like I'm warranted in that belief. It doesn't seem like I know that exists. Or here's another illustration. Suppose I'm a cyborg, okay? I have this cybernetic implant that gives me an intuition that an object contains metal, if and only if it contains metal. Now, suppose, however, that I had this object in my hand, this widget. Let's see. All right. And this cybernetic implant is saying, okay, this contains metal. But now suppose I discover that this implant is malfunctioning, and it gives me the intuition that it contains metal, regardless of whether it contains metal. Well, then it seems that I'm not justifying it the right way. I don't really know that the object contains metal. And it's very much similar with evolution because these invisible non-natural properties are causally inert. Evolution would give us these intuitions of moral wrongness existing, regardless of whether this morality existed. And that would seem to undercut such intuition from properly justifying our belief in morality. So one problem is that on atheism, it seems likely that we don't really know that this moral wrongness exists. It doesn't seem like we have any way of knowing that it exists.
Gotcha.
And it seems like we would need something like supernatural clairvoyance to know that this invisible non-natural property exists. And
Gotcha.
in conjunction with that, there's the fact that, well, on atheism, this property is really weird. Like, to give an example of what I mean by queer, that there's an argument from queerness against morality. It kind of, to illustrate what I mean by that is, imagine I say, there's actually an invisible unicorn floating above my head right now. It's invisible. You can't detect it, but it's just there. You'd be justified in believing that this unicorn probably doesn't exist. Well, why? Because it's wildly different from the types of things we know exist. And when something has that type of queerness, we usually award it with a low probability. And it seems that sort of thing happens. It applies for non-natural moral wrongness on atheism. We have this non-natural, invisible thing we can't empirically detect. We need something like supernatural clairvoyance to know it exists. That's wildly different from the types of things we know exist. So it seems on atheism, God's non-existence, it seems unlikely that this sort of moral wrongness exists. And that's why if I were an atheist, I'd say, well, I think moral wrongness is just a delusion brought about by evolution to get us to behave in certain ways and help our species survive. It's like God's existing. It's just something that probably doesn't exist. And that's what I believe for an atheist. It seems unlikely that it would exist.
I got two responses for that. So one of them is I think it'll guide us a little bit to epistemology, because you're saying, well, that's not likely, or this is more likely if this is true, and a lot of that it seems just to be relying on intuition. So then I could ask, what justifies the intuition? And I think that gets us into epistemology. But
Yeah,
just real quick, just one thing, because I think this is important. Do you think we can see things like love or not?
like empirically observe it, or like
Yes, empirically observe it.
empirically observe it. No, I think we'd have to use introspection to know that it exists. It'd be a different type of experience.
Gotcha. So let me just get you where I'm coming from. I think you can see empirically like love, and I know this sounds wacky, so let me just explain. Right? So we have abstracts which exist in your mind, and then concretes which exist in the real world. Concretes are objects or the property of objects, and I think you can see the property of objects. Now, love is a tricky one because you can't see love directly, right? Unless you have like a brain scan or whatever. But even that, right? So I don't think you could see love directly, but you could see love indirectly through actions, through behavior. Like, for example, I'll just give you a very quick example. You could see it through markers. That's indirectly. When you feel love in yourself, so you have direct experience of love in yourself, correct? And then you see how you react. So these are markers of love, right? Maybe you smile. That's just one example. When you have love, you smile. So if you see other people smile, that's a marker for love. And then you just keep adding markers until you do see love, actually. But that love is a tricky one, I will admit. But I do think you can see the property of objects, either directly or indirectly. Sorry, do you have anything to say to that? Or
Okay,
is
when
it
you
still
said
weird?
love, I was thinking like, do you see that if I myself experience the emotion of love? I thought that's what you had in mind. If you mean like we can infer that someone is in love with somebody else, well, if that's what you mean, then yeah, we can observe love in that sense.
Well, and I think science relies on that. It's not just direct observation, it's indirect observation. It's through markers, right? Either we see X or the consequences of X. And for me, that's empirically verifying something.
Yeah, okay. I mean, that doesn't really apply with morality because, as I mentioned, moral nihilism and moral realism are empirically indistinguishable from each other. But yeah, you can empirically detect some things. Now, you asked about how do we know that intuition is reliable? So that kind of gives us into the problem of skepticism. It's like, how do we know anything? And in philosophy, there's like something called the problem of the criterion. So there's a question. It's like, okay, how do we know? Like, what do we know, and how do we know it? What's the criterion for knowledge? And there are a number of like approaches to the problem of criterion. One of them is skepticism. That says like, well, we just don't know anything. Another one is like the Methodist approach is that we start with a criterion, and with that criterion, then we can assess what we know. And then there's particularism, and that is like we just start with particular instances of knowledge. And kind of how we do that is through intuition in the broad philosophical sense of the term. That includes things like us mentally seeing that 1+1 = 2. And I think I'm a particularist. I think we just start with individual bits of knowledge through intuition. And, we
Through
kind of have to start
intuition or
somewhere.
through senses?
Well, senses would be like an example. Like intuition, the broad sense of the term is what the consciousness, what immediately apprehends, what is directly present to one consciousness. So in the philosophical literature, you can see
Hmm.
like a term sensory intuition, and that's what it refers to. So there's sensory experience, and then there's kind of like what we could call rational intuition, the deliverances of reason, like I mentioned earlier, how we perceive elementary truths of logic and arithmetic, like us mentally seeing that 1 + 1 = 2. That would be an example of intuition. We kind of start with what we directly perceive and work from there.
Got you. I'm going to ask you something very strange because you were telling me it's likely or it's not likely, and that seems to rely on intuition. And then I'm asking you, what justifies intuition, or is that like the base rock? Uh, Let me ask you, if this is too hard, like too broad, I'll go first. Like, what is your like epistemology? Can you show me like your epistemic axioms or axiom, and then see how that builds up your epistemic system? Because that would help me in
Well, I'm
regards to your arguments.
So in epistemology, there's something called foundationalism, which is there are certain beliefs that one has, but they're not believed on the inferential basis of other beliefs, and that's kind of where you start as a foundation. And so I'm a foundationalist in that sense. I think you start with like some sort of bedrock, and like intuition, certain things that would kind of just seem true to me, and kind of start from there. So for example, I believe in mathematics, I believe in science, I believe in logic. So I,
Hmm.
I use like a lot of mathematical theorems, or made reference to a few theorems in my little presentation to give a more concrete idea of how my epistemology works. And I believe it's wrong to torture infants just for fun. There's just stuff that seems true to me immediately, and then you kind of work from there. It's like those premises I mentioned, for example, like given God's not existence, it is unlikely that moral wrongness exists. And my reasons for that had to do with, the argument from queerness. We noticed, like just like as a matter of casual observation, that if things fit into that category of queerness, we give them a low probability, a low prior probability. Like in the absence of any evidence for it, we give them a low probability. That's something we can casually observe, and then through like sort of like casual introspection, it seems like if atheism is true, moral wrongness, invisible, non-physical, empirically undetectable, we need something like supernatural clairvoyance to detect it. It seems to clearly fit in that category, and it would seem like special pleading to not award that a low probability, while we would award a low probability to an invisible dragon in my garage.
Gotcha. I find introspection, intuition, gut feeling to be very dangerous in terms of like epistemology. Like, let me give you my epistemology. So my epistemic axiom is that my perceived reality is the actual reality. That's my epistemic axiom. But I'm not saying that like my senses prove my senses. I think that's ridiculous. It would be circular. Uh, I don't know what cannot be proved that way, right? But my perceived reality is my actual reality, and then I allow my senses to correct my senses. So an example I give, um, uh, have you ever heard a cougar? It's an animal. Have you ever heard it scream?
I haven't heard a cougar scream. No.
You could like have YouTube videos. It sounds really weird. People say it sounds like a woman getting murdered. By the way, sorry for the sensitive topic. So it kind of sounds like that a little bit. So, for example, if I was in my home and I'm hearing, these horrible screams, again, it sounds like a woman being attacked. If I hear those screams in my mind, I'm like, yep, that's a woman's really getting hurt out there. If I open the door and I look outside and I see a cougar, which is an animal, just making this horrible noise, I'll change my mind. I'll be like, oh, never mind. It's not a woman getting murdered. It's just this animal making this horrendous noise. So I allow my senses to correct my senses. Does this make sense as a epistemic axiom? Do you hold the same axiom or no?
Yeah. So part of what I meant by intuition, in the broad philosophical sense of the term, that would include the intuition that the external world is real and that our sense experiences are at least somewhat reliable.
Gotcha. And here's the thing. Here's the thing. For me, that's the only epistemic axiom I have. I think I could get everything else from this axiom, but
Well, I
I'm
don't think that's
wondering.
quite true. I mean, think of like modus ponens as a rule of logic. If P, then Q. P,
Uh-huh.
therefore Q. It seems like you would have to use rational intuition. Otherwise, you couldn't believe anything else.
No, I think you get it through this. Let me show you how. Or let me show you how I think how. Maybe I'm incorrect. So, modus ponens relies on contradiction, right? Modus ponens is deductive logic, I believe. So it has to be the case, or else there's a contradiction, right?
Okay, so your reasoning is that if something being false leads to contradiction, then it has to be true. Is that the reasoning here?
I'm sorry, repeat that again.
Okay, so if something being false leads to contradiction, then it's true. Is that your reasoning here?
Yes.
Okay, because that's just an example of modus ponens. You just use modus ponens to prove modus ponens. So that's actually a sort of classic problem in philosophy. So Lewis Carroll, the author of Alice in Wonderland, he was a logician, and he had this story called "What the Tortoise Said to Achilles," and he
Hmm.
kind of illustrated that problem. Because it seems like pretty much any time you're trying to justify modus ponens, you're actually implicitly using modus ponens reasoning, and that's
I
why it's
think
kind of mentioned. It's kind of like a bedrock principle you just see as true.
I think what it's using is uh, the law of non-contradiction, is it not?
You could, but then if you're going to use like, okay, so what if you could use the law of non-contradiction? Well, then you say, well, if something being false leads to the law of non-contradiction being false, then modus ponens has to be true. But then again, that's just using modus ponens to justify modus ponens. That's circular reasoning.
Oh,
Eventually, you're
gotcha.
going to have to find some bedrock here.
Gotcha. So let me tie the bedrock. So the law of non-contradiction, like contradictions cannot be. I think that's tied to our senses. And an example of this is, we have not seen contradictions so far. Every time we think there's a contradiction, if you look deeper, uh, there is no contradiction. Somebody's lying or somebody's mistaken. That's usually what happens. So this is how we can infer the law of non-contradiction. So I don't see the law of non-contradiction or modus ponens. I don't see it as bedrock. I see it
Okay,
as, yeah, that's true because that's what our senses tell us.
okay, so if your reasoning is because if our senses, um, in our maybe like in the limited number of years of existence, if we've seen no violations of the law of contradiction, therefore the law of non-contradiction is true.
Yes.
Okay, that's again modus ponens reasoning though.
I don't know how that is.
Okay, if if we haven't seen any like violations of the laws of non-contradiction in our sense experience, then the law of non-contradiction is true. With me so
No,
far?
I know it fits the structure, but I'm saying I'm not even using that structure.
You would have to be, at least if you're using an argument, inferring it, making that inference, you would have to be implicitly be using that argument. If your reasoning is that, well, because we haven't seen it in nature, therefore this law of non-contradiction is true. If
I
you're
don't
using
think.
that structure, if that's the conditional you're using as part of your argument, then you're going to be implicitly using a modus ponens structure.
My maybe it is fitting that structure. I don't think so, but let me see. So like, uh, if I perceive it in reality, uh, it's the actual reality. This is my epistemic axiom, right? I could totally be brain in a vat, all this and that, but this is what I'm starting at, right? So anyway, so if I perceive it in my reality, it's the actual reality. And when I perceive reality, I'm not seeing contradictions. So I'm inferring that in the actual reality, there is no contradictions. Now I'm totally open to being surprised. That wouldn't even make sense to me, right? But I'm totally, willing to be surprised. I just don't think that will happen because it just has not happened. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Okay, yeah, but I mean, it seems like a real, because then you're going to have to be using some principle, some a priori principle to extrapolate that set. Because I mean, I don't think you really need to like look at the external world, have any sense experiences to know that there are no married bachelors.
So I
Or
think I've heard people say that before. Like, if you deny the law of non-contradiction, you have to use it or something like that, right?
sort of. I mean, we could get into like there are dialetheists who people who do think there are true contradictions, but even dialetheists tend to say that as a matter of general principle, we tend to accept that the law of non-contradiction applies in most general cases. And there's an example would be like a Turing machine. Turing machine is basically like a type of computer.
Hmm.
Is it possible to have a program where, given fed finite input and a finitely long program, is it possible to determine have a computer to determine whether that the program will eventually halt as opposed to looping on forever? And we can prove that it's not the case. We can't construct a computer like that, a Turing machine like that, and we can know this without ever observing the world, just by assuming that something akin to the law of non-contradiction is true.
And I would say that's totally fine. Like you could have the law of non-contradiction as your axiom because it is one of the axioms of logic. So I know people use that as a starting point. I just want to get a little bit more basic, right? It's like it's totally fine if you want to say things cannot be contradictory. That's totally fine if that's your starting point. Uh, but for me, it's not. I go a little deeper. It's like, but why? And for me, it's because I'm not seeing any contradictions. That's why. Uh, Just real
You would
quick.
have to be infer from that because you don't see contradictions, that therefore there are no contradictions. That's an inference. And for any kind of
Yep.
inference to be made, you have to be using some a priori principles like modus ponens.
Maybe, or
Think of it
I'm
like,
not
here's another example.
convinced.
Think of how science works. We believe that if we do certain sort of pollution, this will cause climate change. It'll be bad for us. That assumes that the future will relevantly resemble the past. Now, you can't prove it by experience. It's just something we all accept. We kind of assume it to be true. Whenever we're
Yep.
making an inference, beyond our immediate sense experiences, we have to rely on some, kind of a priori principles. Like we can't prove that principle of induction empirically.
Yeah, I don't see what's the problem with that because I was saying like I'm totally open to the law of non-contradiction not being always applicable. I don't think that that'll be the case, but for example, I've heard people say that like you cannot deny, like if like with the example you gave with the computer, or other people will ask you like, is the law of non-contradiction false? And if you say yes, it is false, and you're saying, well, there you go, you're using it. You're using the law of non-contradiction to say it's false because it can't be false and not false or something like that, right? And it's the way you would answer a question like that. It would be something like, is the law of non-contradiction false? You would say yes and no, and then you would say something like, well, that's nonsense. You're contradicting yourself. And somebody would say like, exactly, I am. I don't believe in that principle.
Well, no, my point was that you can't have the I'm going to start as my base assumption as like what I perceive in reality is real, and have that be your only axiom. That doesn't really work as a foundation because to go anywhere beyond what your immediate appearances are, you're going to have to use inferences. Those inferences are going to have to be based on something other than what you immediately perceived, like believing that the future will relevantly resemble the past, for example.
But isn't that just induction based on the senses?
Well, you can't use induction to justify induction. That would be circular reasoning.
Wait, I'm sorry. Repeat that again.
You can't use induction to justify induction. That would be circular reasoning.
No, no, no. How that was induction? How that was induction justifying induction? Like repeat the whole thing. I'm sorry. I think I
So,
missed it.
okay, so so the inductive principle I was saying was that the future will relevantly resemble the past. Now you could say, how do we know it? Well, you could say, well, it's worked so far for us. So far it's worked us really well,
Yep.
and therefore it will likely work in the future. That
Hmm.
because okay, because it happened in the past, therefore it will likely happen in the future. Well, that reasoning is just simply using induction to justify induction. That's circular reasoning. So you can't really use our experience to justify induction. Like here's another way. Imagine counter induction that says because it happened in the past, therefore it will likely not happen in the future. And counter
Hmm.
induction is self-consistent. The fact that it worked so badly in the past is precisely the reason to expect it'll work in the future. So both induction and counter induction are consistent. So how do we know the true? Well, you can't use induction to justify induction. Otherwise, you could just use counter induction to justify counter induction. And either in any case, it's circular reasoning anyway. Circular reasoning isn't good logic. And so
No,
why do we believe in induction? Well, just because it seems true to us. We accept it as kind of like a foundational belief.
no, I got that. I think I told you in the messages. Like, I don't think consistency is enough to justify anything because we can all
Oh,
make up.
yeah, I agree. But my point is, the fact remains that even though induction is consistent and counter induction is consistent, they're both consistent. So how do you know which one is true? You can't use consistency to judge between the two. Eventually, it comes down to the fact that, well, it just seems true to us that the future will probably relevantly resemble the past. It just seems to us that that's the way the universe operates.
Gotcha. I don't think that that's induction justifying induction. Let me tell you why. Like we're saying, A then B, A then B. How do we know A then B? And I think it's because we observe A, and then we observe B, right? And then you could say like correlation is not causation or something like that, or just because it happened in the same order or in a good order. Uh, if we have strong correlations over time, over various experiments, and it still holds, then you just infer causation. Now, I don't know if that's induction proving induction, right?
Yeah, it's sort of, if you're assuming in your inference that, so again, the induction that I had in mind that I was talking about was the idea that the future will relevantly resemble the past. So how do we know that the future will relevantly resemble the past? How do you know that's the way the universe operates? If
We
your
don't
reasoning
know
is
with
that,
100% certainty.
no, I know, but how do we know that I'll put it another way. How do you know that the future will probably relevantly resemble the past? What
because
justifies their belief that it probably will? Like, the sun will rise tomorrow, for example. What justifies that belief? And you say, well, the reason why we believe that the future will relevantly resemble the past is because that type of reasoning has worked well for us so far.
Mhm.
Then that's using induction to justify induction. It's circular reasoning.
I don't see it. I don't know. Maybe I need to think about it more.
Well, again, think about like, okay, the reasoning is like to oversimplify it a little bit. Maybe oversimplifying will make it easier. That if it happened in the past, it'll happen in the future. So how do we know that this type of reasoning will work? Well, this type of reasoning worked well for in the past. Therefore, it'll happen in the future. That's assuming that very same inductive principle to justify the inductive principle.
To be honest, I don't know if that's a problem.
You don't know why circular reasoning is a problem?
No, no, no. Uh, I don't see how it's a problem to see a pattern and be like, yep, okay, I see the pattern. And then you add. So like if you just stop there, yeah, that would be problematic. You're saying I'm totally open to the. So here's the thing. So in science, you're not close to the evidence, right? If you were close to the evidence, I totally agree with you. But you would be like, here's a pattern. It could change. This is, being open-minded. It could change. If further evidence comes in and it changes, I'll report on it, right? But so far, I'm gonna go with what I have. You go with what you have.
Yeah, but if you're using the inductive principle to think what will probably be true, like, climate change, for example, for pollution, we don't just say, well, it could be true that if we pollute, we'll change the climate. It's not just that. We also believe that it probably will. So we really need to take serious action to change our behavior to mitigate the damaging effects of climate change. We believe that certain things of the future are true. We believe, for example, that the sun will probably rise tomorrow. We believe that these physical laws that our engineers have relied on, to have bridges work, those will probably work in the future. So when I drive my car on the bridge, I'm not that worried that the laws of physics will change and I'll just plunge down below to my watery grave. We have these beliefs what will probably happen, and for those beliefs to be justified, we're going to need to assume something like the principle of induction, that the future will probably, at least, relevantly resemble the past.
Yeah, maybe. I have to think about that more. Let me just real quick go through. I don't even know if it's relevant or not, but
Yeah,
let me
so
just
you
go
can look it
through.
up. The problem of induction. It's a very well-known problem in philosophy.
Yep, I'll look through it. I'll be honest. I don't see the problem if you're open-minded, but I'll look through it because maybe I'm not seeing how. Maybe I'll change later.
Well, the
Let me.
problem is that how we know that induction is true, and my position is that, well, in practice, we accept it on the basis of intuition. It just seems true to us, and that's why we in practice do it. We don't really have a good argument for induction. You could say, well, it happened in the past, therefore likely happen in the future, but that's circular reasoning. So that argument is going to work. So what argument do we have? Well, in practice, at least, we don't have an argument for induction.
I
Not
don't.
not one that's circular arguments are not good. So we don't have a good non-circular argument for induction. We just believe it because it seems true to us.
Yeah, I don't think you need an argument for it. Like
I
you're
agree.
you're.
You don't need an argument for induction. That's
But
kind
I
of my
think
point. In
I think the
practice,
I think the reason is because you're seeing it.
um, seeing the seeing induction, you mean seeing it work in the past?
The pattern, yes. Like
Yeah, we
for
see the
ex
pattern, but you can't infer from that pattern and make an argument that, well, because this pattern has happened in the past, therefore it'll happen in the future. That's using induction. So you can't use induction to justify induction. That'd be circular reasoning.
I see. I think it's I'll think about it. Let me just go through something else. This is what okay. I don't know if you agree or not. I call it like the maybe this word is not proper to use, but like the evolution of epistemology, like how we've changed over time. Uh, so we have like we start with superstition or irrationality, and it's we just believe based on feeling, based on gut, based on old books, things like that. And then we move on to like modernism or rationality, and we're trying to look for reasons or look for the evidence that justify our feelings, right? Or justify an old book. I feel this way, but why? Uh, and then eventually, you hit bedrock or something like that, right? And then we move on to postmodernism, and you were saying like it's kind of amorphous earlier before we got on live, and I think that's when you become skeptical of reason. And I think if you stay there for too long, it's dangerous because you kind of lose. You become like an epistemic nihilism if you stay too much in postmodernism. but that's because you're seeing the limits of reason. And I think the final stage is postmodernism, and it's you still use reason, you just admit the limits of reason. Like I was telling you earlier, like this is my epistemic axiom, like my perceived reality is my actual reality. But I totally admit that it does not justify itself. It's just where I start from. So
I'm not sure I
yeah,
agree with that history of epistemology. I mean, I think a lot of us start out with rational. I mean, we might have some irrational beliefs. I think we start out with a rational, like start out rationally, like I believe that the external world is real. I believe that there are other minds. I believe there's another human being before me, and so forth. So we start out with rational. It seems like by postmodernism, you're talking about skepticism, which is about attacking the limits of reason, and that's been around for thousands of years. I mean, go
yeah.
back to the ancient Greeks, for example. It's like about as long as we had Western philosophy, there have been skepticism, saying that we have limits of reason.
When I'm saying like the evolution of that's probably not the right word, because I sometimes do think about it like culture's advancing, but I think it's more like an individual. Maybe metamorphosis is better because it happens within your lifetime. You start a bit irrational, right? You just take things for granted, right? You go with your feelings, you go with old books, with what other people told you, and then you try to look for reasons, and then you start finding the limits of your reason, and hopefully you don't get stuck there, and you still use reason while admitting the limits. So sorry for that. Let, let me real quickly go through my epistemology. Uh, I realize that it's not fully ironed out. So for me, my perceived reality is my actual reality, and then from here I justify my criteria to determine if something is real or not real, objectively real or not real. So for me to label something as objectively real, the criteria is it has to be consistent in itself, and then consistent with other well established ideas. It has to be parsimonious. These are good, but then the ultimate things that grounds arguments or grounds anything that's true, objectively true, is reality itself. Right. So if you can confirm something directly or indirectly, so if you can see something or see the consequences of something, that's how you ultimately ground stuff. If you don't have empiricism, um, it's weak for me. But I think I could still accept if your argument is consistent with itself and with other well-established ideas, like probably like the laws of physics or whatever, and it's parsimonious. Like this argument is the most logical. Like it just does not contradict itself at all, and it does not contradict well-established ideas, and it assumes the least possible. I would still accept that argument as objectively true, even if there's no empirical evidence for it. Do you have? Let me ask a question. What justifies? So I understand what did you call it? The empirical intuition or the sensory intuition. I understand that. I have
Yeah,
that.
so intuition, an example of intuition, the philosophical sense of the term, would be the intuition that the external world is real and that sense experience is at least somewhat reliable.
Yeah, and I yeah, I agree with that. So we have um, quick before I go into intuition. Let me tell you why I worry of intuition. So we have sensory neurons. These neurons give us information of the outside world, right? We have interneurons. Sorry, sensory neurons give us experience. Interneurons give us thinking of that experience, and then motor neurons give us movement or action. Uh, I think when you say intuition, I think you're just really stuck in the interneuron stage. So let me give you an example. Um, you're saying like we have a world outside and then a world inside. Um, we have senses. We sense stuff. We see stuff. We see objects and we see the property of objects. Uh, and then we have imagination. And imagination is the world inside our head. We can play with ideas. We can change the objects or the property of objects. We can make things bigger, make things smaller. We can do all kinds of stuff. But how do you know when your imagination is actually also on the outside?
Um, I guess I'm not sure what you mean by how do you know your imagination is on the outside. All right.
So, like for example, I think imagination is powerful uh, because it helps you create hypotheses that you can later go on and test, right? Uh, um, how do I tell? So like, imagination is powerful, but sensory experience is very important because it helps constrain your imagination. It helps it become more orderly.
Oh, okay.
I'm sorry, my mind went blank for a second. What was I asking you? Oh yeah, yeah. So
You said
we
intuition was problematic, and I would like, to clarify, I'm not saying when I say we use intuition to know stuff, I'm not saying that all intuitions are created equal. So, for example, if I have a hunch that's going to rain tomorrow, that's not on the same level of the intuition that my sense experiences are reliable, or my intuition that my memory is at least somewhat reliable, or my intuition, or my rational intuition that 1+1 equals 2, or that modus ponens is a valid form of inference. So when I'm saying intuition, I'm not saying they're all equal. And that's kind of when I used arguments, because then I can specify, okay, here are the premises. These premises seem true to me, and
Mhm.
then we can clarify, like, maybe where our points of intuitive perceptions differ, where our intuitions differ exactly. So, for example, is it morally wrong to torture an infant just for fun in that Humean ought sense? Now, my intuition says, well, yeah, of course, it's wrong. And your intuition may be different. Maybe you don't believe in the Humean ought, and that would be an example of how to clarify the disagreement.
well, okay. Let me just say this. So I think I don't think I would not bundle intuition and then include um, like senses in there. I wouldn't do that.
In philosophy, that's how intuition is defined: what is present in the consciousness and what the consciousness immediately apprehends. So that would include, for example, the intellectual seemings to be true, like the seeming to be true that my sense experience is at least somewhat reliable and that the external world is real. All that's encompassed by intuition in the philosophical sense of the term.
Gotcha.
And rational intuition would include, a priori truths, deliverances of reason, and that would be an example of intuition in the philosophical sense of the term. That's why I started off by how in philosophy the term intuition is defined. Now, sometimes
The
it's defined a little bit differently. Like sometimes intuition is defined in a way to exclude sense experience, but in other contexts we have phrases like sensory intuition, in which it is included. But the idea of, like, consciousness, what's immediately present to the consciousness, what the consciousness immediately apprehends, that's pretty common in epistemology and philosophy.
gotcha. The reason. Oh, I'm sorry. I keep getting. I keep forgetting what I'm gonna say. What was I gonna say? I'm so sorry. Can you repeat the last thing you said?
In philosophy, that's just how intuition is defined: what the consciousness immediately apprehends and what is directly present to one's
Thank you.
consciousness, and
I,
that would include things like the intuition that sense experience is at least somewhat reliable, that 1+1 equals 2, and so forth.
Gotcha. The reason why I think that's like problematic to bundle all this stuff, or maybe it's okay to bundle it, just make distinctions, sharp distinctions, is because I think it can confuse the sensory neurons I was talking about, and then the interneurons, right? So sensory neurons are, sorry, this is just pure experience, right? And then if you hold the axiom I hold, perceived reality is actual reality, that's that's bridging the gap between what's in your mind and out of your mind. But then we have interneurons, and that's when we're thinking about what we just experienced, and that's what we would call imagination. Like that's subjective reality. It only exists in your mind. You can, for example, you see various things, various objects, various properties, but in your imagination, uh, you can switch you can switch it up. And then like if you have a lot of data on stuff, you can make more accurate predictions. So for example, let me give you an example because this is getting kind of weird. um, let's just say you knew the personality type of a bully. Let's just say you have a bully, you're dealing with a bully. Can you hear me, by the way?
All right. Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. uh, let's just say you're dealing with a bully and you're trying to find out how to get him off your back. He's just bothering you the whole time. One thing that you can do with this bully is um, sorry. So if you know his personality type, you're saying, how can I navigate this uh, without ending up in a fight, but with him leaving me alone? If you have a sensory experience, a personality profile on this person, you can imagine what would happen. You can imagine, you know what? If I just speak very calmly to this bully, and I'll just tell him, I'm having a hard time. I don't know why you're doing this to me. I'm just, feeling very down and sad. Can you just leave me alone, please? And then you imagine how that would play out. You can imagine the bully making fun of you, or the bully apologizing, the bully punching you in the face. You can imagine different possibilities, right? But how do you know? How do you know how that would actually play out? That's just your imagination, right? And of course, this imagination is backed up by empirical data. It's you have his personality profile. You've seen him act before, but how would you know how this person would actually react? And I think at the end of the day, you have to test your hypothesis. You've already created something in your imagination, but you have to go and do it. So if you think you have a good shot at success, or maybe even if you don't think you have a good shot at success, you should go try it out. And I think that's how you find out if this is only true in your head, only imaginary, or if it's also objectively true, if it's also in the real world. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, in some circumstances that works, but on the other hand, there are things that we can know without sensing things. Like for example, that there will be no Turing machine that can solve the halting problem. The halting problem is the one I mentioned before, where finite input, finite large program, will the program eventually halt? We don't need empirical experience to determine whether that's true. And there's certain axioms we need to do inferences from our sense experience. So you can say, okay, we have these sense experiences. Now, what do you do with them? How do we use them to infer from other beliefs? Well, for those inferential rules, you have to use a priori, like the principle of induction, the idea that the future will probably relevantly resemble the past,
Uh-huh.
and all sorts of inferences that we have to make. And so, yeah, sense experience is great. I mean, we need empirical science, we need empirical data. But as far as like the rules to infer other rules, you can't just get that from your sense experience without having these other assumptions in place. Like, for example, I believe that my memory is at least somewhat reliable. You have to rely on memory. You can't just use senses to do that. And you have, yeah. So, yeah, sense experience is great. We need empirical data. But
Can
then, of course,
you
ultimately, we come down to one of the reasons why I had an argument, like introduce those arguments. Okay, here are those arguments. It's fine to discuss like epistemology in the abstract, but eventually, if we're going to discuss like whether God exists, we eventually have to deal with the evidence. Like for example, does moral wrongness exist in that human not sense? What do we do with the software-like order in the universe? Are we just going to accept that it's a happy coincidence? How plausible is that?
gotcha. Do you think the principle of parsimony is? Do you accept that or not as a criteria to get objective truth?
I think that if all other factors are held constant, the simpler theory is the one that's more likely to be true. Though, notably, the idea that simpler theories are more likely to be true, more likely than complex ones among empirically indistinguishable theories is a self-philosophical claim that we ultimately have to rely on intuition.
Gotcha. So let me just clarify what I mean. So I've heard people say, Occam's razor is simplest theory is true. I don't like to interpret it that way. That's why I said principle of parsimony instead. It's like I'm trying to be economical, and by that I mean produce the least possible assumptions. And I'm not saying that it's possibly true that if somebody assumes a whole lot, can still get it right, right? I can assume less, somebody else can assume more, and they can still get it right. I'm not saying that's not possible. I just think that um, you're more likely to get it right if you assume less. That's what I mean by principle of parsimony.
Again, I think if all other factors are held constant, the simpler theory is the more one that's likely to be true, the one that has the fewest assumptions and so forth.
Gotcha.
That's if all else. I mean, because if you say that parsimony is the only thing that matters, you could say it could be a solipsist. I could say only I exist. There's nothing else in reality. Everything around me is akin to a hallucination or a dream, my experiences are just brute facts with no explanation. So that would be similar. Um, on the other hand, we kind of accept the intuition that the external world is probably real, that memories are at least somewhat reliable, and so forth. So
Yep.
parsimony is important, but it's not the end all be all. These other factors have to be taken into account, and that's kind of one of the reasons why I believe in God. Is those arguments I mentioned earlier is that those premises seem true to me, and if these logically valid arguments have true premises, well then they're sound, and God probably exists.
Gotcha. So they're consistent. The premises
Well, not
are
just consistent. I think
justified
they're actually true.
by intuition.
Intuition. Well, that's part of it. I mean, like, how do I know that it's wrong to torture an infant just for fun? Well, it just seems true to me that it's wrong to torture an infant just for fun. And so, in one sense, there is like an intuition matter of that. It just immediately seems true to me.
And what does wrong mean?
So I'm using, well, roughly we could say that an action is morally wrong for an individual if they ought not to do it in that Humean ought sense, that type of ought that does not have only descriptive qualities.
Gotcha. And then what is what we ought not to do?
Just what I said, that Humean ought sense. Are you looking for an example of what is morally wrong, or are you
No,
asking
like
for?
what is what we should not be doing?
Well, I think not torturing infants just for fun is a good start. I don't think we should be doing that.
Hmm. That's so that's like a particular example. What is the
Yeah, that's a specific
universal
example.
what is the universal rule that grounds that?
Well, that's beyond the scope of the argument. So I don't know all the
Gotcha, gotcha,
necessary and
gotcha.
sufficient conditions for all moral principles. I mean, one common one that Jews and Christians accept, and likely a lot of atheists do as well, is that we ought to love our neighbor as ourselves. And if you just apply logic and reason to that principle, you get a whole host of other rules. Like if you love your neighbor itself, well, you
Yeah,
wouldn't murder them, you wouldn't steal from them, you wouldn't enslave them, and so forth. So you get a lot of rules that way just by applying logic and reason to that particular principle.
gotcha. This might be uh, outside of the scope, but do you go with deontology, like moral rules, or more like with utilitarianism?
Well, I think they're like kind of both stem from that principle. I mean, like it's like for example, pleasure and like happiness and freedom. They're good things, but as a combination of things. Um, but ultimately, I think we kind of all these questions are great, but I'd like to kind of poke and prod a little bit about which premise you think is false, if there is a false. But my understanding is that you don't believe the Humean ought, right? That type of ought that does not have only descriptive qualities. You
Uh,
seemed to
well,
be denying that premise earlier. I just wanted to be
I
sure.
so I haven't really fully constructed my morality yet. I could have a morality that's purely descriptive with moral axioms, and I think I can have a morality that's descriptive and prescriptive.
Well,
Uh, if
by
you
the
add
moral ought, are
a,
you saying the conditional ought in your conception of the moral ought?
what do you mean conditional? I'm sorry, these
Conditional ought
terms
are
are hard
yeah. So
for me.
in the conditional ought or a hypothetical ought is it takes the form of like an example would be if you want to do well in school, you ought to study. Just means something like as a matter of practical necessity, you need to study to do well in school. So it refers to a possible action that's practically necessary to achieve some goals. So we use that sort of thing all the time in kind of ordinary language. So there's that type of ought. But there's another other type of law that we use in order in conversation and having to do with like you should not torture infants, where that ought does not have only descriptive qualities.
And you said that's like a categorical, right?
Well, I
Wrong?
described it as a Humean ought because that's the type of ought that David Hume seemed to have in mind in his ought distinction.
Yeah, I think I could construct a moral system that has a
Humean
human.
ought.
Yeah, I
So
think I
if you
could if I add and again I think I already said this, a moral axiom, or if you don't like that word, a special moral axiom. It's different from all the others, and then it, you're like, well, yeah, but it could it be true or false? Doesn't really matter to me. It's just it's there.
Well, I mean, if you could say, like, you could start with a moral axiom in the sense that I assume, as a kind of like a foundational belief that I hold on to, that this moral ought exists. You can have that. But if it's a human ought, well, then you have this problem of the fact, like, well, if atheism is true and this human and this moral wrongness exists, how do we know about it? It's invisible, non-physical, empirically undetectable. It doesn't seem like we could be any way of knowing it. And then you have that probabilistic tension I mentioned earlier, where it seems that given God's non-existence, it's unlikely that this exists.
Gotcha, gotcha. So like hmm. So like if I here let me speak for like just a minute. I'll be fast. If you see like a man beating a dog, right? Just an example. I think I can see what's I think I can see immorality, right? Because immorality is decreasing suffering. I'm seeing somebody increasing suffering, so that's immorality. I'm seeing
Okay,
immorality.
so are you defining immoral behavior as that which increases suffering?
Sorry, repeat that again.
Are you defining morality as that which increases suffering? Is that the definition you're working with here?
I don't know if I can hear you. Morality or
Are
immorality?
you defining morality as because remember because my illustration before of the dog kicking scenario is that moral nihilist who doesn't believe in moral wrongness and a moral realist who does
Hmm.
They agree on all the same physiological and psychological facts involved. They agree that the dog felt pain, suffered minor injury. But the moral analyst says, I don't think moral wrongness is associated with that action. It's not associated with those natural facts. Moral realist says, I think moral wrongness is associated with those facts. Well, those two views are empirically identical. They agree on all the same empirically observable facts. Now, you could kind of resolve this problem by redefining morality. You could say, by immorality, by moral wrongness, I just mean decreasing suffering. Is
Right.
is that how you defining immorality here?
Yeah, it's a working term. You
Okay,
can say
but
like,
if you define morality that way, that's not the definition of moral wrongness or immorality that the argument uses. The moral semantics of that moral argument, and really the moral semantics of the average person in the street, is that it uses that Humean moral ought, the type of ought that doesn't have only descriptive qualities. So do
uh,
you believe in the Humean moral ought? It sounds like you don't.
got you. So I don't want to sound like I'm slippery. I just haven't completely thought that out, right?
Okay, you can be
Um,
agnostic and say, I don't know whether the Humean ought exists. Is that your position?
sure. I mean, I can see two moral systems just running parallel. One of them, Humean, right? Like it's a is and a not. It describes if something is moral or not, but also prescribes like don't be immoral. You have to be moral. And then one that doesn't do that. One just that describes. I can see both of them running parallel. I don't really know which one I choose yet because I'm still agnostic on that.
Okay, so
But I do live
maybe
my
this is simpler.
life.
Do you believe
I do
that
live
there
my.
are Humean oughts? There are true facts that have the Humean ought. Does it exist anywhere in reality, or are you agnostic about whether the Humean ought exists?
My human is like what we should do, right?
Now, the Humean ought is a type of ought that does not have only descriptive qualities. So it prescribes in a way that is not purely descriptive.
Gotcha,
So,
gotcha, gotcha, gotcha.
so like the conditional ought, remember how that ought had a purely descriptive meaning?
Hmm.
The Humean ought does not have a purely descriptive meaning. It doesn't have only descriptive qualities. Do you believe in that sort of ought, that Humean moral ought?
I guess my answer right now is not sure. I do live my
Okay,
life as
agnostic.
if it were
That's fine. I just wanted
uh,
to be sure where
just
you
just
stood.
just real quick. I do live my life as if as if it were that way, as if it were descriptive and prescriptive. And I when I talk to people, it's always prescriptive, right? Like, yeah, you shouldn't be immoral. You should be moral. Sorry, you should not be immoral. You should be moral. Sorry, those words sound kind of the same.
Okay, so it sounds like then, if you're not sure whether that Humean ought exists, you would be agnostic about the truth of the second premise, and that's
Right?
where presumably our intuitive perceptions would differ somewhat, because to me it seems clear that something it is morally wrong to torture an infant just for fun in the ordinary moral semantic sense. So yeah, that would be an example of why some people are atheists, some people are theists, and some people be maybe agnostic, as they have like a different intuitive perceptions on that front. And with the applicability of mathematics, why is it that we happen to live in a software universe as opposed to a randomized hard drive universe? You could say, well, it's just a happy coincidence, and people can like intuitive perceptions. Because for me, from my standpoint, I mean, it's not quite on the level as the fine-tuned asteroid shower about how it's like immediately obvious that it's evidence for design, but it's like it's somewhere kind of in the neighborhood, maybe at least halfway there. It's like because when I was in high school, I was like, okay, does God really exist? Because I've been told it exists. Does it really exist? And at this time, I had an interest in both physics and computer science.
Hmm.
And as I reflected on it, it's like, it is really weird that we find algorithms imprinted into the universe, isn't it? It's really, really happy coincidence that it happened to be that way. And just, yeah, it's given atheism seems like unlikely that we would expect that to occur in the epistemic coincidence sense. And that's why I kind of, back in high school, I leaned closer to designists because it seemed unlikely to me.
Gotcha. I I don't. Uh, how do I say this? I I don't share that intuition. Like for example, I do think that the fine tuning and like the cosmological argument, I think those are the best arguments theists use. Um, but yeah, like I don't share that intuition. For example, like I don't see any evidence that the universe was created to begin with. It could have just always been here. You know?
Well, here's why I wouldn't accept that even if I were an atheist. Well, I don't think like eternal in the sense of it being sempiternal, that is existing for an infinite period of time. Because there's something called in philosophy, there's the eternal society paradox. So imagine society that has the abilities of ordinary human beings in each year of its existence. This society has existed eternally for throughout an infinite past, and they have this tradition. Okay, they have this tradition each year. They flip a coin. If it comes up heads, then they all get together to do a particular chant, but only if they've never done the chant before. Let's say, like the chant is Grim Reapers do not exist or whatever. If it does not come up heads, they do not do the chant for that year. So one possible outcome from this annual tradition is that the coin comes up heads for the last time, in which case they all get together and do the chant. You're with me so far?
I'm so sorry. I'm thinking a little bit slowly. Can you repeat that again? Just a little bit slower. I
Okay.
think you're speaking a
The
little
annual
fast for me.
tradition for this eternal society is each year they flip a coin.
Uh-huh.
If it comes up heads, then they all get together and do a particular chant, but only if they never did the chant before. If the coin does not come up heads, then they do not do the chant for that year. Are you with
Okay.
me so far? That's the
Sure.
tradition. Okay. Yeah, they practice this tradition every year.
Uh-huh.
One possible outcome from this is that the coin comes up heads for the first time last year. In that situation, they all get together and do the chant because they never did the chant before. You with me so far?
Okay. Uh-huh.
Now, coin flips are probabilistically independent events. So
Yeah.
if that scenario were possible, then it would have also been possible for the coin to come up heads each year. Now, if the coin came up heads each year, did they ever do the chant? Again, coin comes up heads, they do the chant, but only if they never did the chant before. So if it comes up
Right.
heads each year, did they ever do the chant?
Yes.
Yeah, they had to have done the chant because it comes up heads last year. They would have done the chant then if they had never did it before. So they had to have
Right.
done the chant.
Right.
And yet they also could not have done the chant.
Why?
Here's why. Any year you point to, there is a year prior to that which they would have done the chant had they not done the chant before. Because if it comes up heads, they do the chant, but only if they never did it before. So the
Right.
result is a contradiction. So what the Eternal Society paradox shows us is that an eternal society armed with the abilities of mere humans would have had the ability to actualize a logical impossibility. And as the paper that talks about this says, like, surely there's something metaphysically suspicious about an infinite past. An eternal society with the abilities of ordinary humans could have brought about a logical contradiction. It's
see,
more
I
likely
see.
that the infinite past was just never metaphysically possible in the first place. So I don't think an infinite past is possible. Here's what I would do if I were an atheist. If I were an atheist, put on my atheist hat on here, I would say, okay, the past is probably finite. But the cause of the universe beginning to exist wasn't a personal cause. It was just some sort of, impersonal cause transcending space and time, very different from the laws of the universe as we know it. That's what I would believe as an atheist because of that eternal society paradox.
Gotcha. Let me respond as an actual atheist. So, yeah. So, just real quick. Why I don't believe there's evidence that the universe was created. Now, I will respond to your objection. I promise. People usually cite like the Big Bang. The Big Bang only states the universe was compressed and then it began to expand. It doesn't state if it began to exist. That's still unknown for us, right? So right now you were pointing that like infinite regress cannot exist. Therefore, there had to be like a first cause. I agree. That was a good objection by the atheist. The one that you played right now, that was fantastic objection. It's like, you know what? There maybe is a first cause, but why is it conscious, right? I don't see why it could not be unconscious, right? And then not just that, then I can ask that very same paradox to that first cause. Did that first cause always exist
No.
infinitely
You
into the
couldn't do
past?
it with that first
Why
cause
not?
because the cause, as I mentioned before, would be outside space time. It would be timeless sans the universe.
And
So
that's
outside of
even
time, there is no change. There's only being and non-being. So there would be something, transcending time and space, not really part of it.
and for me that sounds even worse, kind of.
It's
So it's like,
strange, but it's really the only way out of the solution. If the past is finite and
uh-huh.
whatever begins to exist at a cause, you have to use something different from what we ordinarily conceive brought the universe into being, some sort of like transcendent cause. And that's why even if just this far, if you just take this step and not go, there are further arguments for the cause being personal. We can ignore all that. Even if we just take this step, there's like a first cause transcending space and time that operates very differently from the laws of the universe. We have like a sort of de facto supernatural first cause, and that would
Why
seem to
de
make
facto?
de facto because it's transcends space and time and different from the laws of physics and chemistry as we know them.
Well, why wouldn't quantum fields be something like? So, for example, I've heard some physicists say of time or space are emergent or foundational, and a lot of them are actually believing that it's emergent, which to me actually does not make sense. I do not think that will be end up being true, but I'm not a scientist, so I won't
Well, suppose it's true.
comment on it.
Suppose space and time are emergent from some underlying physical reality. The cause of the universe would be transcending space and time altogether. It would be
Well,
outside this quantum reality that from which it emerges from. You have to be something
no,
very different. We don't have any experience of anything outside space and time causing anything.
quantum
That's
fields. So for them, quantum fields are more foundational outside of
no,
space,
they're not
outside of
outside
time.
space and time causing things in the universe, though. They're just part of physical reality.
Well, that's what I've heard physicists say. Like, yeah, it is physical reality. If you can interact with it, physical reality. These fields, it's like layers. When they interact with each other, they create particles, right? Anyway, so sorry, just real quick. I've heard physicists say that quantum fields are actually spaceless, timeless, blah blah blah. I've heard some of them say that's
They're
not.
not spaceless and timeless. They're still in time. They're just even. It's just yeah. It's kind of complicated. Um, but yeah, long story short, it would be very different from what we know from laws of physics as we know them to create the universe, to
Hmm.
create like physical, like all matter and energy, space and time, all that being created outside the physical laws as we know them, because we don't
Why
have
would it?
anything outside space and time creating matter and energy. That's just not something we have experience with. Even if it's like an emergent what you're describing as an emergent property, that's these things are still in space time, within that contiguous space time realm.
I
But anyway,
don't. I don't.
I'm not even offering the cosmological argument. That wasn't even part of my argument. I used the
Gotcha.
teleological argument, the fact that we live in a software universe rather than a randomized hard drive universe. How it would have to be a very happy coincidence for that to take place.
Yeah. So if it's chaotic, sorry, if it's ordered, you think it implies like consciousness, right? Being the
It
first cause.
seems more likely, like think of the fine tuned asteroid shower.
Sure.
It's a similar type of that intuition. It's like, well, it seems unlikely that we'd be observing this asteroid shower if there were no design involved. Similarly, out of the numerous ways the universe conceivably could have been like, we end up with a software universe instead of a
Mhm.
randomized hard drive universe. Just like if we had ones and zeros set randomly, it's very unlikely we'd get a software-like structure. And yet, that's exactly what we observe. We observe a software-like order to the universe, and that's like, well, that's a very happy coincidence. That seems, if all we had to go on is that there is no designer at all. The fact that we live in a software universe rather than a randomized hard drive universe is very unexpected. It's very surprising on atheism.
I don't know. I see the universe and it's constantly changing. It's
I mean,
constantly. It's pretty
and in one
chaotic.
respect, it is constantly changing. On the other hand, it's still a software universe. We have these mathematical algorithms imprinted into the universe's behavior. That's how science has been amazingly successful in precisely predicting behavior.
One question: if the algorithm changed with time, would you stop believing in God, or would that be like evidence against God?
If the algorithm changes time, it might depend on how it worked. I mean, I think there's a lot of evidence for God's existence, and that was just
Like
one bit of evidence.
by algorithm, I'm talking about like the fundamental, not the emergent. The emergent stuff changes all the time. You kind of agreed with that, right? The universe is changing constantly, but
In one sense, yes, but we still find
foundationally. Sorry, go ahead.
mathematical algorithms imprinted into the universe. Those physical laws, as far as we can tell, haven't changed.
Right, and I think you're looking more like at like the foundational stuff because like chemistry, like biology. I think these things changes more. Maybe like the more fundamental stuff are more constant or probably constant forever. What if they changed though? Like, what if like imagine fundamental stuff like photons. You can't divide
So
a
you're asking
photon.
if what if the physical laws themselves changed, right?
Yes, like the speed of light changed over time. Would that
Well,
be evidence against God?
well, it awfully depend on the change involved. I mean, if it would have to change like very radically. If we still live in a software universe, but things like change just a little bit. I mean, maybe a little less confident, but very minimal.
I don't understand why.
Well, because we would still, by and large, be living in an we still be living in an algorithm software type universe. Al- Algorithms imprinted in the universe. So I mean that part. I
Mm,
mean, if something were more like a randomized hard drive universe, if things started changing like wildly randomly, like a randomized hard drive, that would
mhm.
probably maybe decrease my confidence that the universe was a product of design. On the other hand, would I stop believing in God? Well, no, because there's all this other evidence that makes me think that he probably exists.
Gotcha. Well, here let me tell you my argument against this. So I think this is kind of speculate. So just real quick, Penrose has his CCC model. I think he's called it like cyclic cosmic cosmology model. I think I kind of messed it up, but just search up Penrose CCC. He has like an infinite regress model. So I don't know if I necessarily agree that the universe couldn't be an infinite regress, but if it had a first cause, sure, it could be conscious or unconscious. It's ordered, therefore you think it's more likely conscious. Where was I going with this? Sorry. What was I going to bring up?
It
Sorry,
doesn't
my
seem like maybe you're going. So maybe the past is infinite,
no, no.
and
Penrose, he's a theoretical physicist. He has proposed mathematically consistent models. His cyclic cosmology model, something like that. Just search up Penrose CCC model. It's an infinite regress model. It's consistent internally, so there's no contradiction in it. But so I don't know if I necessarily buy that we cannot have an infinite regress. It's just counterintuitive. But
well, there's the eternal society paradox that seems to suggest an infinite past probably isn't real.
yeah, but
At the
I,
end of
I,
the day, you're going to have to ultimately have to attack a premise of the argument. I presented a logically valid argument, and it seems like the only way to go is to deny
I'll
the
have to
second
think
premise.
about that one. I'll rewatch the recording and then maybe I could come on again and talk about that specific argument uh, next
But
time.
yeah, the premise that I would attack for the that teleological argument, I would just
Mhm.
say, well, it's just a happy coincidence. We just got really, really lucky that we live in a software universe rather than randomized hard drive universe. In that epistemic coincidence sense, that seems to be the escape hatch for the atheist. And then a disputed point would be like, well, seems really coincidental. I mean, maybe not at the same level as the fine-tuned meteor shower scenario, but to me, it seems like halfway there. It seems like we really, really lucky. It's like very suspiciously coincidental.
Would we be lucky to have a God?
Um,
Like, why is there a God?
why
God
is there
just
God? Well, my view is
is.
that he's metaphysically necessary.
But what if order is metaphysically necessary?
Right, and I discussed that objection earlier in the presentation, and I used like
Mhm.
the difference between like metaphysical probability and epistemic probability. So, given just atheism, what sort of things would be more likely? What would we expect? And like the fine-tuned asteroid shower is something we wouldn't expect. And if you say like, well, maybe that those fine-tuned parameters for that asteroid shower is just metaphysically necessary. Yeah, but we can. It's just as easy to conceive, parameters being slightly different so that meteor text showers wouldn't exist. And that sort of principle applies for the software universe. Like, you know, it's just as easy to think of a metaphysically necessary, randomized hard drive universe. And ultimately, you say, okay, epistemically, yeah, it's not what we would maybe naturally expect. It's in an epistemic sense, it's an extremely happy coincidence. And then it's just disputable point. It's like, well, okay, how acceptable is that relative to the design inference? I mean, maybe it's not at the same level as the fine-tuned asteroid shower, but to my opinion, it's like at least halfway there. And that's a disputable point. Whether how plausible is it that we just got epistemically lucky that it's a happy coincidence?
Gotcha. Okay, so I actually did think up an objection. And just real quick about the paradox that you showed me. Like,
Yeah,
I'm
the
so
eternal
sorry.
society paradox.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm extra slow. I'm just really tired today. I will rewatch this. You're posting this on your YouTube, right?
Yeah, you could play back on my YouTube channel.
Listen, I will pay very, very close to that argument. Like,
Okay,
very,
I
very
actually have a
close.
vlog episode that discusses the eternal society. So you can find that in my. I have like certain vlog episodes, and I have
What is
an
it called?
episode specifically devoted to the eternal society paradox. Maybe that'd be useful to you.
Eternal Society Paradox. That's where you best describe it, right?
Yeah, that's. I have an episode on that on my YouTube channel. You can take a
Oh,
look at that if you want to delve further.
I will. I will look at further and then provide my objections for that one specifically. Okay, so real quick, and then I don't know if you want to have me on, but if you do, I'll discuss that one if I manage to find any objections. Um, or if not, maybe I could be back and tell you that I didn't find objections. Maybe I changed my mind. Oh, sorry. Anyway, I actually do have what is the word? Um, um, Counter arguments. So that came up in my mind. So your reasoning was that if the universe is chaotic, intuitively we would expect it to be like an unconscious first cause. But if it's orderly, intuitively we would expect for it to be ordered. Uh, Here's my
Well, not
objection.
exactly. The actual argument was this: if God does not exist, then the software-like order is just a happy coincidence. The premise too is that it's not just it's not a happy coincidence. The conclusion is therefore God exists. And the kind of justification for that second premise is that
Mhm.
it seems too coincidental. Like in
Gotcha.
the fine-tuned asteroid shower, it's like, well, it just happened to be that we have this metaphysically that the parameters happen to be that way. It's just a coincidence. But then the question is like, hey, is it too coincidental to be very plausible that we
Gotcha.
just is a happy coincidence? And that's where people's intuitive perceptions can differ. So I think, even atheists will tend to say that if we had a fine-tuned meteor shower, that's too coincidental. Clearly there was design involved. Now what about a software type universe as opposed to randomized hard drive universe?
Mhm.
That's well, it's coincidental. It's a very happy coincidence. Is that
Mhm.
too coincidental to make design to make rejected design inference where rejecting design inference is not reasonable? Well, people can vary there. By my lights, it seems like strong evidence for me, but your mileage might vary. People can have different intuitive perceptions.
Gotcha. So my argument against that would be, I can have a more likely true explanation for that. And let me tell you why more likely. So let me just real quick refresh my criteria for determining if something's objectively real. Consistent, parsimonious, and then, confirmed by reality somehow. Um, I have an argument that, so like both your you're saying that, so we do have an ordered universe. And an explanation for that is that we have a conscious first cause. I do agree
Well,
that that
not necessarily first cause. There are other ways. I mean, for example, Leibnizian cosmological arguments don't have a cause in the sense of being a first cause. You could have something like continuously sustaining something into a being. So it wouldn't necessarily be a first cause. It could be some other sort of explanation.
or conscious causing. Is that
Yeah,
better?
some sort of like underlying, design framework perpetually causing it to being. Now, I don't think that's very likely because of the eternal society paradox. I think the first cause is more probable. But that's like an alternative thing you do. Like, it's very
Gotcha.
important to understand that this argument is my teleological argument is
Mhm.
logically valid. The only way it can fail to be sound is if there's a false premise. So then what I would do if you're trying to think of an objection is which premise do I want to attack?
Yeah.
And it seems to be the obvious premise to attack is that second one, that it's not a happy coincidence. I just say, we just got lucky. It's a happy coincidence. And just kind of stop there.
Gotcha. Gotcha. So I don't think I think I could do better than that. Hopefully, I'll try to do that right here. So just real quick. Um, our universe is ordered. I'm gonna go with first cause right now. I understand you brought up a different one. Let me just go with first cause right now, just so I could get my point across. So our universe is ordered. And a possible explanation for this is that we have a first cause that is conscious. Um, an alternative explanation is that we have a first cause. I think that's more likely. And you're like, what's the difference? It assumes less, so it's just more parsimonious. So I think that's just more likely. What do you think about that objection?
Well, okay. Let's think about it analytically.
Yeah.
Which premise does that objection attack?
Wait. I'm not talking about the your argument right now. That argument, the eternal society paradox. I'm gonna
No,
come
no, I'm
back.
not talking about the Eternal Society part. I'm talking about the teleological argument I mentioned earlier. The argument, remember, was this: if God does not exist, then the software like order universe is a happy coincidence. Premise two: it is not a happy coincidence. Conclusion: therefore, God exists. Now, remember, by happy coincidence, I'm talking about coincidence in that epistemic sense.
Mm,
I mean,
I'm so sorry to have you do this. Can you repeat your argument again? I'm so sorry. Very,
sure.
very slowly. I'll write it down.
Okay, premise one: if God does not exist, then the universe's software like order is a happy coincidence. Premise two: it is not a happy coincidence. Conclusion: therefore, God exists. And by coincidence, I'm using coincidence in that epistemic sense. So, like, think of the fine tuned meteor shower scenario. Even if you say, well, maybe it was metaphysically necessary, there's still some sense in which it is unlikely we'd be having this observation if atheism were false. And that unlikeliness is has to do with epistemic probability.
Okay, first premise. Oh, that's what I'll attack.
Okay, if God does not exist, then it's just a happy coincidence. So, do you think that
Yes.
given atheism, given God's not existence, Um, does that give us any a priori reason to believe that we'd be living in a software universe rather than a randomized hard drive one? A
I would,
priori.
I don't know if I priori, but by looking at the world.
Yeah,
So,
well, see, that's what I mean. It's
uh,
when you're talking about an epistemic coincidence. Atheism,
I,
the idea that the universe does not exist, would give us no a priori reason to believe that the universe would
mm,
be like this way. That's what I mean by epistemic coincidence.
gotcha. So, like, I don't know what could be known a priori, like how
Well,
God would or wouldn't behave, or how the
well, here's
universe
an example of
would
what
or wouldn't
things that
behave
we could.
without God,
Well, here's an example of something we could know a priori. There are no married bachelors. There's no Turing machine that can solve the halting problem.
because of contradictions, correct?
Yeah, so those are examples of like a priori expectations. Now, if
And
it,
then my response for that is, well, yeah, because there's a contradiction. And I think we learn through our experiencing of reality, there's no contradictions here. Or you know what? I'll just take that as an axiom for now. Yeah.
okay, but yeah, that's sort of what I mean. It's like another way to think of it. Imagine like ones and zeros being set on a hard drive. Now, if they're set randomly,
Mhm.
it's very unlikely that we get a software type order involved. Very
How would you
likely.
know? How would you know a priori that God is ordered, or that God would create ordered universe?
Oh, that's a good question. So think of the fine-tuned asteroid shower in the fine-tuned asteroid shower illustration.
Yeah.
Now, do we know a priori that if the universe were designed, this is what we would expect? Well, we don't know that a priori. On the other hand, it seems that this sort of thing is more likely if the universe were designed than if it were not. So it's a kind of relative probabilities are different. And that's why I think it's kind of like the design of the universe. Like if I give you a hard drive, for example, and I say, maybe the information here was a product of design, maybe it was randomized, I don't know. And then you look at it and you find that there's software on there, there's mathematical algorithms imprinted there. You would say that, well, it seems more likely that it was a product of design. Now, if it were randomized ones and zeros, then you'd say it's more likely to be a product of just a designer could have done that. It could have been like assigned ones and zeros randomly. But if we find like software, it seems more likely to be a product of design.
But precisely how a priori? Because for example, you've never seen software before. You don't know if software is automatically orderly or not. That seems very strange to me.
Okay, well, think of the fine-tuned asteroid shower. How do you know
Yep.
that's a product of design?
I think because of experience. Like we
Very
see
good.
how
Okay,
things behave. So it's not a priori. It's empirical.
right. But and yes and no. So we have an interesting question. It's like, well, how do we know that things are designed? Um,
Yes. A
well, one
priori.
example is kind of like maybe our experience of how minds operate, and the way that we've experienced minds
Mm,
operate is that we do find that we create text, for example. That's one of the things that minds do. Another thing that
I
we've seen
agree.
minds do, by the way, is create software.
Yep.
You with me so far? So you could justify that way, saying, well, given the way that we know that minds operate, and given out of the many conceivable ways the universe could have been like, the fact that we live in a software universe rather than a randomized hard drive universe, because
Gotcha.
otherwise it would just seem to be like a really happy coincidence.
No, that now that makes sense to me because you're saying we look at it, right? Like we see intelligence and consciousness make orderly stuff. So that's where your intuition comes from. We look at
Yeah,
it.
you could argue that way.
Yeah, I think that way is better. But for example, like I can do that to argue the opposite. And let me give you an example. You're saying intelligence or consciousness um, produces things that are orderly. I would argue things that are not conscious. They don't have markers for consciousness. They also produce things that are orderly. And then here's my examples. Uh, my examples would be: have you ever heard of Conway's Game of Life? You could go to YouTube. Anybody can do this and just type Conway's Epic Game of Life. He
Okay, I don't think that illustration is going to work. Do you know why?
I think what your objection would be, you're saying, well, human created that software, so
Yeah, you're
you're,
still operating with mathematical algorithms that were created by human beings.
and I would say I don't think an objection works because that's humans trying to imitate nature. Like he creates pixels, and then he creates rules for the pixels, and that's enough to create complexity. Now let's see what he's trying to prove here. So we have objects, and then the objects have properties. That's the rules, right? And that was enough for it to create rules. Now, I do agree. I do agree. In this example, it was created by a consciousness. I agree with that. But what if our universe is like that, right? When we now let me give you an example from nature, things that were not created by a software engineer or stuff like that. When I look at complicated stuff like ice crystals, right? Water. That chemical has no markers for consciousness. The markers of consciousness that we determine to see if other people are conscious, those are or other animals, other plants, other biological stuff. The markers of consciousness are not apparent for chemicals of water, H2O, and yet at certain temperatures and certain conditions, they make orderly stuff like ice crystals. So this is an example of nature that's not conscious producing order. So that's why I would say, actually, I don't know if my intuition agrees with you that only because it's chaotic, you know, it must be unconsciously made, and if it's orderly, it must be consciously made
Well, I
because
didn't say must be consciously made. So
or
again, think of
could it most likely is.
well, yeah, that's kind of like it. I think it gives, like I say, operator are the numerous ways the universe could have been like. Instead of
Yep.
being randomized hard drive universe, we find a software universe. Now, there's the epistemic and metaphysical explanation for this. So metaphysically, you could say it's metaphysically necessary, for example. But then that doesn't solve the epistemic problem. You'd have to say, well, okay, epistemically speaking, it's a coincidence. And it's a coincidence in that epistemic sense. And out of the numerous conceivable ways it could have been like, it happens to be have fit that order. And yeah, you have different intuitive perceptions about whether it's too coincidental or not. I think, yeah.
You just made me think of another objection, but just real quick before I move on. Uh, how would you respond though to what I said? Like for example, I have examples of nature producing things that are orderly, and when you look at this nature, it has no markers of consciousness.
Well, I
So
would kind of
ice
respectfully disagree
crystals.
because all those examples of nature producing order are relying upon physical laws, which have this algorithmic structure everywhere. And then we go back
Agreed.
then we go back to the argument.
Yeah, I guess I see your point. But my point is like, you know, how do you build your intuition? And you build your intuition by looking at stuff to
Well,
see
part of
how
it,
things
I mean, part of
behave.
it is that we kind of like maybe introspection of how our own minds operate. And it just seems natural, intuitive to us that
But sorry, go ahead.
that this is the kind of the way things operate. I mean, you could say, well, it's like, well, you don't see nature. You could say that, well, we don't see nature producing text, and that's how you know it's a product design. But here we have an example of, well, this text is found in the underlying laws of the universe.
Gotcha. Let me quickly respond. So you were saying like how things operate. What kind of things? Abstract things or concrete things, right? Abstract is like in your imagination, but how do you know how things operate in the real world? And I think what I would tell you is you have to look at it, right? How do things behave in the real world?
Yeah,
And
that's
when you
rely on science
well,
to discover these physical laws, algorithmic structures exist in the universe.
right, and I would argue that's how you build your intuition, right? Like your intuition is uh, things that are conscious produce order or can produce order, and things that are not conscious normally are just chaotic without producing order. Your intuition would come from your senses, but so you look at humans, right? For example, just real quick, you look at humans. Humans produce order like software, and you're like, yeah, that's building up my intuition more and more. That consciousness produces order. Or you look at like bees, and they build very organized. What do you call those? Their homes. Their
Hives?
yeah, hive. If you look at a hive, it's very complex. So you're like, yeah, I'm looking at the structure of the hive, like the physical structure that they build, where they make the honey. Yeah, I'm looking at conscious, intelligent things build orderly stuff. So that's where I get my intuition that consciousness produces order. Uh, but I also look at nature. I do the same thing, and I'm looking at ice crystals, for example, and I'm looking at them. They have no marker of consciousness, and yet I'm seeing the order being produced. There's many examples like that. Like hold on, I mean I could Google examples of like nature creating things that look orderly, and when you look at that nature, no signs of consciousness are there. What are those? It's like the Earth. It makes like a hexagon shapes. I don't know what's it's like cracks on Earth. I'm sorry, I'm not gonna bring up the example because I can't even word it correctly. But we can stick with ice crystals. Like I'm also building my intuition through empiricism that nature can actually produce uh, order, even unconscious nature.
Well, I agree that nature produces order, but the reason why they produce order is because we have this underlying algorithmic structure of the universe, and
Uh-huh.
which in my opinion does seem to be evidence for design. Because as I said, there are numerous conceivable ways the universe could have been like,
Uh-huh.
but it happens to be not a randomized hard drive universe, but a software-like order universe. And you could say, well, that's a happy coincidence in the epistemic sense.
Gotcha. Uh,
And so it still seems to me you would be denying premise too. Then you have, like I said, you know, disagreements about how plausible it is that we'd be that lucky.
gotcha. And I think I'm going to move on to a different point just so we don't get stuck um, just repeating ourselves. And I'll think more about this, by the way. Just I want to ask you one final question on this specific objection to like move on to other ones. Uh, when you're saying how things operate, uh, that's based on your intuition. And
Um,
that intuition, is that based on empiricism? Yes or no, or whatever, however you want to answer.
so I'm relying on my intuition to believe that my sense experiences are reliable, and I'm
Yep,
also relying on my sort of intuition that testimony is reliable because you have to understand that. How do I know that science has this algorithmic structure in the universe? Well, I'm relying on people's testimony that there are such things as scientists, and scientists have actually performed the experiments that have done these things.
sure.
So it ultimately comes from intuition. Less indirectly, it comes from sense experiences. And then you branch out further that I'm relying on people's testimony. I mean, I suppose it's possible I could be in like a Truman Show like situation where everybody's been fooling me and spoon feeding me false information.
Gotcha.
Nonetheless, I assume that what's in my physics textbook is actually accurate.
Gotcha. Okay. And I'll move on. I'll just say that I would say that experts are also kind of established by the senses. Like, if the experts are not able to predict, I wouldn't really trust them that
Well, I
much.
assume they predict it because I haven't actually seen all these experiments myself to find out that these predictions have been accurate.
Gotcha. But like, how do I say this? Us as a humanity, we've thrown out whole fields and the whole expert consensus as a whole, like with alchemy, because uh, you would ask for basic predictions that you could verify yourself. If you can't do that, novel testable predictions, I think we just throw the whole field out.
I only even if I were a scientist, I would only be able to like do a very tiny fraction of the experiments myself. There's just too many experiments, too much science out there. I would eventually have to rely on people's testimony that these experiments took place.
Gotcha. And I would let me just quickly bolster my point. I would argue that the intuition that we should trust experts relies on the senses again because uh, you could think about prior experience. People that normally spend more time studying something, they normally know more about that, right? And then I don't know. I guess you can test your intuition of going to the hospital and get medicine, or going to like a witch doctor or something, or getting magic crystals, the cards read, and then you see the results. Who has better results? And I think maybe that's how you also establish who is and isn't an expert, like who has better results. What do you think?
Maybe I think it's like just practically impossible to determine who's an expert and who isn't all by yourself. I mean, like
Agreed.
when I go to see a doctor, I don't compare him like with a witch doctor to see who has better results. I'm just gonna go to the doctor and trust that he knows what he's talking about. And then people say, "Yeah, we've done these experiments, we've done these tests, we know that medical science work. This guy is like a medical expert and so forth." So ultimately, in practice, I'm still have to rely on testimony.
But like I would say, like if a lot of people were giving like testimony and witnessing, like, hey man, these magic crystals are really healing me up. Yeah, I would actually
Yeah,
try
I
them.
suppose. I mean, if I were raised in a different environment, maybe we believe like very different things because of a different testimony. So I mean,
Gotcha.
so yeah,
Yeah,
there's like intuition. My sense experiences are at least somewhat reliable. Then there's sense experiences. I'm observing people and I'm observing they're giving their testimony, and then it branches out further to say science, all this, the algorithmic structure of the universe exists and so forth.
gotcha. Okay, real quick, I'm gonna jump to like another objection that just came to on the top of my head. But before that, and you tell me if this objection is not even relevant. So we have. Okay, let me see the premise. If we don't have a god, So if sorry, I like major premise shorter. If there's no God, the universe being ordered would be a coincidence. It's not a
Yeah, in the
coincidence.
epistemic sense.
Therefore God does exist. So if there's no God, the universe being ordered will be a coincidence. I disagree with that premise.
So remember when I'm talking about coincidence, I'm not talking about metaphysical possibility. I'm talking about epistemic probability. So
Could you
given
explain that a little bit further?
epistemic probability has to do with evidential relations, often between propositions. So given atheism, all right. So here's another way to think about it. Think of a hard drive universe.
Yep.
Our hard drive, its ones and zeros are set. Now, if it's random, we don't have any more reason that one bit would be assigned one rather than zero. So in philosophy, there's something called the principle of indifference, where if our state of information among a set of propositions is equal, it doesn't favor one over the other, then we kind of award them all with the same probability. Now imagine we applied that, but with a hard drive, where each one and zero is one no more likely to be one rather than a zero.
Hmm.
And if we assign that, what is the most epistemically likely result from all that? And the result, most likely result from that would be ones and zeros assigned sporadically with no meaningful pattern.
Gotcha. Can you? So that's the principle of indifference, right? Like it wouldn't really matter how things are.
Well, the principle of
In what
indifference
order?
is
It wouldn't
that
matter what order.
well, the principle of indifference says that among propositions, if one is no more likely than the other, then we should award them all with the same epistemic probability, if that's what our state of information indicates. So
Gotcha.
think of like three possibilities. If our state, if, suppose we know like, one of these three propositions are true, just to simplify with that example. If our state of information doesn't give us any more likely to expect one being true than the other, then we should award them all with the same epistemic probability.
Okay.
Now imagine we applied that with our hard drive with the ones and zeros. If we have no more reason to expect a one than a zero, then we should award that with the same epistemic probability. If that we continue on the line, so okay, one and zero equally likely, one and zero equally likely, and kind of spread that across throughout like several gigabytes, the most epistemically probable result from that would be ones and zeros assigned sporadically with no meaningful pattern. And the result would be like, kind of a randomized hard drive. Now, I think something similar with that applies to the universe with respect to epistemic probability. To put it in an oversimplified way, there are more ways for things to be different than there are for there to be the same. So it seems to me that epistemically, in terms of epistemic probability, it would be a fantastic coincidence that we find these algorithms, mathematical algorithms, ubiquitously imprinted into nature. And that's why I say, in that epistemic sense, it seems rather coincidental that we live in a software-type universe.
Gotcha.
Just like Einstein says, it's really amazing that in spite of the baffling complexity, Einstein and Wigner mentioned, like in spite of the baffling complexity of the universe, we find these algorithms as part of the universe. We can make amazingly successful and precise predictions. Conceivably, it didn't have to be that way, and yet it is. That's really quite amazing when you think about it. It's amazing that science is as successful as it is.
Gotcha. I got through two objections now. So one objection is I think here we're probably, I'm not sure, but let me just state it then. I think we're confusing possibility or likelihood in terms of like logically possible and then like physically possible. And let me just say what I'm meaning here. By the way, this idea just came to my head, so sorry if it sounds strange or not well put together. So logically possible is something that you're imagining, and it's just something that I guess doesn't contradict itself. And then we have physically possible, and that's more constrained. It's not just if it doesn't contradict itself; it's if reality allows for it. So I think when you're saying like, that's that would be unlikely or unlikely, I think you're in your head a lot. You're talking about how you imagine things, how things would be, but then what reality actually like allows or doesn't allow, or what reality, the values of reality actually assigns. I'm sorry, did that even make sense? Or
like I mentioned before, when I talked about coincidence, I was referring to epistemic probability, not physical probability. That's why I used the example of the fine-tuned asteroid shower scenario. You could say that, well, it's physically necessary. It just has to be this way, that the parameters were fine-tuned in this way. You could make that objection. The problem is that there's still, in one sense, maybe it's metaphysically necessary, but there is another sense in which this is unlikely to obtain if atheism were true. And that type of unlikelihood, the fact that type of coincidence, so to speak, is like, well, it's really coincidence that the parameters happen to line here to have this asteroid shower text. That type of coincidence would be in with respect to epistemic probability, and that's the type of coincidence I'm referring to. That's what I explained in my opening statement. So then we're back. We're still going back to that. It's a happy coincidence type of thing in that epistemic probability sense. And that as I mentioned before, I think that's the best escape hatch for the atheist.
I think my earlier objections actually attacked the first premise, but I think right now maybe I'm attacking the second premise right now. So you were saying like the algorithm, it's a happy coincidence, but I mean, don't doesn't any value have the same probability? I don't know if you said this before, but just real quick, like if the order of numbers, if you were like shifting cards, um, if you were shifting like if you were like randomly, I don't know what you like if you put the card deck on shuffle, I guess, and you started randomly giving people cards. If somebody got the following cards, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, you'd be like, whoa, that's a coincidence. But if you got 7, 5, 4, 3, 2, 6, I mean, isn't that the same probability? You're just assigning meaning to one over another.
Yeah, it has the same probability. So I think you're actually hitting something important here. Like, how do we infer design? There are actually, oftentimes, there are a couple ingredients when it comes to inferring design. One is that there's like a low probability to exist in the absence of the designer. So think of like that cards, for example. Imagine I have like say a royal flush dealt to me when we're playing poker, 10, jack, queen, king, ace, all in the same suit. So there's low probability. And a second criterion is that there's a specification criterion. That is the result fits this kind of non-arbitrary, non-ad hoc pattern. So an example would be, the fine-tuned asteroid shower. So imagine like there are all sorts of ways the asteroids presumably could have fallen on the moon. And they're all maybe, let's stipulate that they're all equally improbable epistemically at least. Why do we award that, wow, that's a pretty coincidental attitude towards the fine-tuned meteor sex? It's because it kind of fits that non-arbitrary, non-ad hoc pattern that seems to like, spark that intuition that this was probably a product of design. Now, I think the fact that we live in a software universe rather than a randomized hard drive universe kind of fits that pattern. It's like, wow, it's really lucky that we have these mathematical patterns imprinted everywhere that make science amazingly successful. When conceivably, like what Einstein said, a priori we should expect something more chaotic. It's very surprising that in spite of the baffling complexity of the universe, we find these regularities in nature, these software order like regularities in nature. And I think in that sense, it would be a coincidence.
And that's strange. Like, why would he expect it to be chaotic? I mean, I guess when you look at nature, you see
Well,
order
remember
and
the
you see
randomized,
chaos, right?
yeah, remember the randomized hard drive thing. Ones and zeros spreads. If the ones and zeros were assigned randomly, we would
Uh-huh.
expect, something relatively chaotic. There are more ways for things to be different than there are for ways to be the same.
I got a question for you. Could it be that the universe is chaotic? I mean, like, so, like, for example, like chaotic or orderly, as opposed to what? Like, I can imagine a world that's way, way more orderly compared to that world. This is chaotic, and
You could.
vice versa. Like, I can imagine a world that's way, way more chaotic, and I'm looking at this one, I'm like, hey, it looks relatively orderly. I think uh, in an Einsteinian way, like it's isn't it relative? And then relative to what? To other universes or relative to your imagination? And I think this gets me back to like the problem of intuition. Like you're stuck in your head.
Well, relative, like basically all of physics kind of boils down to, algorithms imprinted into nature. And we conceive of, something, just bizarrely chaotic, such that life wouldn't even be possible.
And I think I could also, so you could conceive of a universe that's way more chaotic. And I could also conceive of a universe that's way more ordered. So I think it's kind of relative, the chaoticness or the
Well, that's
orderedness.
true. I mean, think of the hardware. Ones and zeros. Could a universe that has software could the software on it be maybe in some sense more orderly? Maybe in some sense, perhaps it could. If I give you hardware that has software in it, maybe there is like a more orderly type of software. But at the end of the day, there's still software on it. We still have mathematical algorithms directing things in an orderly and predictable fashion that allows, like I said, science has been very, very precise. amazingly accurate predictions.
Mhm.
But it's still remarkable that we have that science is as successful as it is. It didn't have to be anywhere near this.
I came up with another objection. Look, I'm so sorry. I know I keep coming up with objections, but I'm just thinking here. This will be like the last one, I promise, because I know we've been here for a long time. Uh, have you considered the multiverse objection? So let me just quickly explain what I'm saying. So imagine that we have a very, very, very compressed, I don't know what we would call this, like the primordial soup. You could call this stuff, I don't know what you call this, the hyper universe, whatever you want to call it, the universe. So we have like a universe, a very, very compressed thing. And then some parts of it begin to expand and then they cool off. And then that becomes a local universe or a universe, right? So they have many, I don't know if this is making sense. Okay, sorry, let me just go back. You have very, very, very compressed I don't know, something made of mass, made of matter and energy, just very, very compressed, and you call that the multiverse, or things that produces universes, whatever you want to call it. It expands off, and then it cools off, and then it forms a universe. So this thing is just making many, many, many different universes. So we have many, many universes, in fact, not just one. And it just so happens that we live in the orderly universe because orderly universes allow for orderly stuff like us to exist. So that's like survivorship bias. What would you think to that objection?
Well, because unlike like ordinary like multiverse things, because usually the multiverse has like we have the same laws, but maybe different constants and different quantities, and that's the normal idea of the multiverse. The multiverse that would have to explain this order is like you'd have fundamentally different physical laws
What do
for
you mean
that to.
different laws? Can you explain that?
Okay, so like the kinetic energy, the physical law for kinetic energy, for example, that for speeds well below the speed of light, it's 1/2 mv squared. So that's an example of a physical law we have.
I see what you're saying. So you're saying same equations, just different values for the
Yeah, that's
variables.
how normally multiverse is thought of. But the type of order I'm describing is just the fact that universe does have mathematical patterns imprinted into it. Just the fact that we do have algorithms, as opposed to being more like a randomized hard drive. For that
I got you.
multiverse scenario too, for what you're describing for survivorship files would be like even just the very basic structure of the universe would be different. And there's the multiple universe. So here's an illustration. Imagine that we have like a bazillion randomized hard drives. Ones and zeros are set randomly. Well, the odds
Uh-huh.
are that at least one of them would have software on them, right?
Yep.
And we could say it's like, well, maybe there's like this enormous multiverse, and our universe just happens to have software on this. Now, that would explain the observation in a metaphysical sense, but then there's still the matter of epistemic probability. Here's an illustration why. Think back to our fine tuned meteor shower scenario. Suppose somebody says, well, maybe there's a multiverse, and odds are one of them would have this result, and therefore, maybe the universe was designed. Well, that's possible. It's a logical possibility. But without any evidence that this type of multiverse exists, it seems enormously ad hoc. It doesn't seem to be the most likely explanation. Given just the evidence we have, it seems that design is the most likely explanation. Part of the reason why is because we can either postulate one new additional entity that is a designer, or we could postulate a bazillion new entities, and that would be extremely unparsimonious. It's not even
It
close
would
to being the
be
simplest explanation.
it would be one entity. Like I told you, if you're supposed to imagine a multiverse. It's just compressed matter and energy, and then different regions of it begin to expand. So it would be one entity.
It's still a multiverse, though. You're still having a bazillion multiverse with all sorts of different physical laws to explain the observation. Now you could say, well,
Well,
this multiverse was caused by a single entity, and you
no,
could
but
have that.
like, so sorry, it would be like one entity with properties. Like laws are just how things behave. Like for example, if we had God, God would also have laws. God would have properties, things, ways that He behaves. So it would be one object, multiple properties. I don't know if you would agree with that, but I think that's a good way of thinking
I
about it.
mean, it just seems like a multiverse under a different name. If you're going to say that we have like multiple universes with multiple different laws, and like the hard drive universe, we have like a bazillion hard drives, ones and zeros randomly set. Odds are one of them would be orderly. That again just seems like a
Mm,
multiverse under a different name.
that analogy does not seem so analogous. So like it would more likely be like a computer that is spitting out, I guess, software, but it's many different types of software. Like so, like this is how I've heard some physicists describe it. It's a very, very compressed region of matter or energy. Let's just go with that. And then some regions of it begin to expand. As they cool off, they pretty much separate from everything else, and that's what we would call a universe or a local universe. Um, I'm sorry, is this even making sense or no?
I don't see how it sounds like you're describing multiverse, and even if you're describing that, you're still be relying on some underlying software to produce the physical laws.
It's so like I think when you're imagining multiverse, you're just imagining different universes existing because they just exist. And I think a lot of physicists don't actually believe that. It's yeah, there's many different universes, but there's a thing that spawns the universe. And the things that spawn the universe is just a very, very they call it a multiverse, but it's you could think about it as the universe itself. It's just a compressed region of, matter and energy.
Right, but what you're describing is for the multiverse explanation to make sense with respect to here,
Mhm.
you would have to be delving way beyond physics as we know them. Because I'm talking about just the fact that we have algorithmic structure in the universe.
Oh, gotcha. Gotcha. I could address that objection real quick. So just real quick, these universes can be different. Some universes will have like the same equations but different values for the variables. Some of them would have the same objects but just different properties to the objects. So that would change causation and actually would change the equations. Anyway, you could just imagine it being some universes being very, very wacky and stuff. My point would be this: we know that the universe exists because we see it. So I know it sounds extravagant to say many, many, many other universes. That sounds like extravagant. I agree, but we at least know the universe exists empirically, and we do not know if God exists empirically. So therefore, my explanation is just better. It's like saying, if we look at just real quick, just to make an analogy, and I'm sorry, I know I'm speaking a lot. If there's like a footprint, right? If we look at a footprint, I could point out an exotic animal. Like, yeah, it's probably a giraffe. And you're like, a giraffe? Dude, we live in Texas. Or actually, there's probably a lot of giraffes in Texas. Dude, we live in, I don't know, Antarctica. What do you mean giraffes? That's very unlikely that the footprint is caused by a giraffe. And I'm like, yeah, but you're saying that the footprint is caused by a unicorn. We have not seen unicorns. We have seen giraffes empirically. What would you say to that?
Okay, so I mean, you could say that okay, we haven't seen designers of the universe, but we have seen a universe. Well, yeah, we've seen this universe. We haven't seen other universes, and you say, okay, we haven't seen designers of the universe. Yeah, but we have seen designers. But perhaps we can cut through the cord and just apply the fine-tuned asteroid shower test. Would that explanation is like, well, we've seen other universes, we haven't seen designers. Therefore, this explanation is better, the multiverse explanation for the fine-tuned asteroid shower. Clearly, it wouldn't, right? We would never accept that explanation as an explanation for the fine-tuned asteroid shower, right?
Sorry, could you repeat that again one more time?
The multiverse explanation, without any independent evidence for it, we would never accept it as an explanation for the fine-tuned asteroid shower, right?
More than the God explanation, I would say, because it's like I
We would
understand.
accept the a multiverse which has no additional evidence for it is more likely than the idea that this asteroid shower text was a product of design.
So like when I'm talking about like a multiverse and then survivorship bias, it's like there's many, many universes out there. We live in the organized one and the orderly one. And then you're like, well, but that's a lot of universes. Why are you proposing a lot of universes? And I'm like, I know that sounds a little bit wacky, but we at least know one universe exists empirically. Do we know if at least one God exists empirically? And if no, just mine is just more probable because we know that category at least exists. And then furthermore, I don't know if we've ever empirically seen a mind without a brain,
Well, we do know that
without
designers
physical,
exist. We do know that designers exist, right?
not the type of designers you're proposing.
Well, then we also don't know that the type of universes that you're proposing exist. And again, just think of the fine-tuned asteroid shower test. But you're saying you would accept that multiverse explanation as more likely than the design explanation.
Let me actually think about that one because that sounds like a good objection. Hold on. So I'm telling you that, like, yeah, we've seen designers, not at the cosmological level, but we've seen them at a like a, I don't know, earthly level. So, okay, so we know designers exist, but not the type of designer that you're proposing. And the designer you're proposing is like a mind without a physical structure. We have not seen that at all. I'm
Well, all,
proposing a
all I've done really
universe.
said is just said I haven't actually So this argument doesn't actually say whether God has a physical or the designer has a physical destruction or not.
I have a
So,
response actually. I just came up with a response. Sorry, go ahead. I'm sorry, I cut you off.
okay, yeah, it doesn't actually have that argument. It just the argument again is that if God does not exist, then this software-like order is a happy coincidence in the epistemic sense. It's not a happy coincidence, therefore God exists. Now you're trying to come up with explanations. Well, it doesn't really seem to attack any premise of the argument. You could say, well, maybe it's metaphysically necessary, maybe there's a multiverse and so forth. And that would maybe say, well, it's not a happy coincidence in the epistemic sense, in the metaphysical sense. And as the fine-tuned asteroid shower illustrates, well, I'm not. There's still a sense it would be coincidental, and that coincidental would be the epistem in the sense of the epistemic probability.
Well,
That's
it
what the
wouldn't.
fine-tuned asteroid shower kind of illustrates.
Well,
And
it
I
wouldn't
think
be.
that's kind of unavoidable that in in the sense of epistemic probability, it would just be a happy coincidence. Out of the numerous ways the universe could have been like, it happens to be a software-like order to it. That seems really amazing. It's a fantastic stroke of luck that we happen to have this type of universe in
I
the
don't think
epistemic
so.
sense.
I don't think so. But I could not even. I don't even have to appeal to the multiverse. I'm gonna just appeal to the universe. We have an observable universe, and then we have parts of it that are not even observable, right? Um, you could say like, yeah, we live in this galaxy. This galaxy is ordered. Maybe other galaxies are not ordered. Why do we live in the place that is ordered? Because we need order to for ordered beings like us to survive.
Well,
So
that's only if we accept the physical laws we know them, because we could easily conceive of a universe where we don't know, we don't have deity order to survive. We can, like, our consciousness just floats around, something akin to ghosts, unaffected by the other physical inhabitants. We could conceive of a universe very different from that.
yeah,
We could
and
see a universe that has only a small amount of order, and the rest of around that universe is chaos. Instead of having this order, mathematical algorithmic structure spread out everywhere as far as we can see. So even a survivorship bias wouldn't explain the order we see. We could, think of a very much smaller type of order. We could think of Boltzmann brains that appears in consciousness for a few moments and then vanishes. So we
mhm.
would need an orderly universe as a survivorship bias. There are all sorts of other ways we can think of, like, observer would exist without having the software like order that we observe.
Right. But if things are too disordered, uh, we're orderly beings, right? So if things are too disordered, I don't know how we would exist. For example, if we
We could
had
exist. We could, even if alone. Well, for a number of reasons. One is that we could have, like, our consciousness would be akin to a ghost, and that the underlying physical structure doesn't really affect whether our conscious properties exist. Another way is to say that our consciousness does appear, but only appears momentarily due to the chaotic fluctuation nature of the universe. Or we could say that there is order, but only on a small island, and the rest of the world is chaotic. So there are all sorts of other ways the universe could be chaotic, and for an individual consciousness to exist. So I don't think you're gonna have survivorship bias
so
really explain that.
so wait, you're saying that we could have chaos, but we could still have conscious beings. Conscious beings are orderly, though. So you're
It's
saying we will have disorder and order.
no. Okay, so remember the explanandum, the thing to be explained. The is the fact that we live in a software universe. So
Mhm.
we can think of a randomized hard drive universe and have consciousness exist, even if only briefly. We don't live in a randomized hard drive universe. We live in a software universe. It's still conceivable for consciousness to exist in a randomized hard drive universe for a number of ways. One is
But is
like
it less conceivable or more conceivable?
they're both equally conceivable. So conceivable just means something that we can't rule out a priori.
I think we rule it out through experience. Like if things are too chaotic, things just don't live. So through experience, we can say that.
Well, that's if you assume that the physical laws. Remember, we're talking about the underlying structure of the universe. Now, in physics, there is something called the Boltzmann brain, where if the constants and quantities were different, a Boltzmann brain could exist. Just through random fluctuations. You wouldn't necessarily need a constant order, but even then, that's still assuming physical laws. We can conceive of different physical laws in which things are different, in which consciousness appears even momentarily, something akin to a Boltzmann brain.
Yeah, that's probably universe. Like maybe. Like I'm not truly convinced by it, but yeah, probably. If there's like a lot of universes, that seems very very unlikely though, because that's just complexity that goes really really fast. Usually, well, at least in our universe, right? And I don't know how we could judge other universes because we only have our universe, but usually it's complexity. starts slowly and it progressively goes up. So just having a brain all of a sudden, that would be a very, very strange universe. But yeah, I agree. If we have different universes and the laws are very, very strange, then yeah, that might be a case. I don't know how that would disprove the multiverse though. Apart from
Well,
saying
I'm not saying
that
it would.
looks
I'm just
a little
saying
silly.
that you wouldn't necessarily that observer selection effect wouldn't necessarily take place. And again, the coincidence in question is epistemic. So at the end of the day, you still have a happy coincidence.
Let me give you an
Um,
example. What if so chaos? Imagine particles. Okay, it's so chaotic they do not even form atoms. They do not form uh, molecules. So I mean, what type of consciousness would be if it's not even, you know what I'm saying? It's really spread out. If it's a conscience that's spread out, that's so strange for me to even to consider.
yeah, it'd be
Um,
strange, but I mean,
Super strange.
so okay. So two reasons why I think the multiverse explanation is inadequate. One is that I'm talking about epistemic probability, not metaphysical probability. The second reason is is that without additional evidence for this very very strange multiverse, that where the just the fact that we have physical laws at all varies. Um, Again, without additional evidence, we would never accept that. Just like we wouldn't accept it for the fine-tuned meteor shower scenario. Nobody
Gotcha.
would say if we had no evidence at all that a multiverse exists and we had this this asteroid pattern, we wouldn't say, well, maybe there's a multiverse. So this really isn't any evidence for design. No, we would
Gotcha.
accept
Gotcha.
that it's at least some evidence for design. We probably think it's very conclusive evidence that the universe was a product of design.
If you see conscious things do orderly things, yeah. But then if you
Well,
see
here we have
unconscious
it.
things do
Remember,
orderly things, you would say no.
well, here we have it's come from nature. Remember, this is a product of physical laws. So you could say, well, here's an example of something that came from nature. Therefore, it's not evidence for design. We wouldn't accept that explanation because it just seems too coincidental that we had this asteroid shower text. Out of the
I
numerous conceivable ways the parameters could have been different, it happened to line in this way in this text. That seems too coincidental.
I will think more about this and then maybe come up with a formal argument and then respond to your formal arguments. I'm just not very good at, I guess, philosophy. Just one thing. I think you did mention like a weak analogy earlier. Like you were saying that like I'm proposing like a preposterous explanation, which I do agree it's a little bit preposterous, right? I'm saying that there's many, many, many universes out there. Uh, but I would say, I told you earlier, I think you're also proposing a preposterous explanation. You're saying
Does
God.
well,
But hold on, just real quick. You were saying that you were you were saying that like I'm saying, how would I know that these universes would be different from us, right? And then I was saying, well, how do you know that God would, God, we have creators, designers. How would I know that creator's very, very different from us? I think it's a weak analogy. I'll finish quickly. It's a weak analogy because I'm proposing universes that are different from ours, but not that much different, right? Not too much different. And you're proposing a designer that's very, very different from anything we've observed before. You're saying a mind without a physical structure. That's very, very strange. I'm saying a universe that's similar to ours, but slightly different, right? And a final objection, I think, would be that I think in the future, if we do see that, um, I think I asked you this question before. I forgot what your answer, but you were saying that if the equations or if the universe in the future behaved more chaotically, will you stop believing in a designer? How much chaotically does the universe have to behave in the future for you to say, you know what, it's probably just the universe changing itself. There's no designer here. You still there?
yeah, I had a problem with my computer for a moment.
Yeah, I
All
was
right,
gonna
so
say real quick. I don't think it would be that much different. Like to get a chaotic universe, I think it would be very similar to ours. You just have to change the property of objects. So, for example, we have neutrinos. Neutrinos usually just pass right through things. They don't really interact much, right? If we make, for example, just an example, if we make photons pass right through electrons, right? So it wouldn't really interact much with it. We have things in physics that do that, just don't interact much with each other. If we have objects with properties like a photon going right through an electron instead of exciting the electron and making it jump, electron shells or whatever. Uh, if we make objects with different properties, like the ones we see here right now. We actually see that right now. Some things don't interact. If we make something like that, I can totally see how that could create a chaotic universe. So I don't think it's completely different. It's very similar to ours, actually.
Well, remember for a randomized hard drive universe, the algorithmic structure would just basically cease to exist. There wouldn't be any type of algorithmic order. In that sense, maybe you could say, well, I have particles, the same particles, but their behavior is just completely chaotic. Okay, maybe it would be different in that sense, but it's still a very large difference. And maybe it's sort of semantics about which difference costs us the huge one. But at the end of the day, you still have the premise of the argument. It's still say, well, by golly, it's still happy coincidence that out of the numerous conceivable ways the universe could have been like, we have an algorithmic structure. It's way more orderly than basically it needed to be for our universe to exist. But yeah, eventually, I think you're gonna have to bite the bullet there. But let's suppose, for sake of argument, though, suppose we go for the explanation version of an argument where it says a design is the best explanation for the universe's order. Would the multiverse be better explanation? Again, when we don't have independent evidence for this, chaotic multiverse. Again, I don't think it would. We wouldn't accept that again for the fine-tuned asteroid shower scenario.
Well, for example, the cosmic background radiation. It's like a photo. You see it. We see the universe coming from a very, very, very small point. So we think that it's compressed. It was pretty hot, and it was just compressed matter and energy. We have a photo of it, right? That would be like the multiverse. Everything is coming from this point. Some regions expand and then get cold, and that would be like a local universe. And these universes are just far apart. I know it's preposterous. You're like, yeah, that sounds really strange. What do you mean? All coming from a small point, and it's creating a lot of universes. That is strange, but I'm just saying it's like this, right? Like, open your eyes, you see this universe. It's like that, but just very, very compressed. And you're saying, open your eyes. It's nothing like what you see. It's a mind without a physical structure. And that it
Well, I didn't
creates
say that
things at the cosmic
the
level.
explanation version of the argument. I didn't say a mind without a physical structure. That's not what I said. I just said design. If we're using the explanation argument, a design is the best explanation for this universe being designed. Now, you can see, depending on what you mean by a physical structure, you could think of like, okay, God does exist, but he exists in the form of like a single particle, and this single particle can do, all the stuff that he did. So I'm not making really any assumptions about the ontology of the designer. And the teleological argument, you say like, arguments from design, but really teleological arguments of philosophy are arguments to design.
Oh,
And then you could
gotcha.
just say the extra step is that, well, the fact, if it is so that the universe was designed, seems to make atheism less plausible. Now, maybe you would only go so far as like Hume arguably was just like, a weak-kneed deist. Maybe he didn't believe in the Christian God. I don't think he was a Christian. But there's some indication he believed that, maybe the universe was a product of design. Now, maybe that wouldn't only get you so far for deism. But nonetheless, I think if the universe were a product of design, would make less atheism less plausible, as I said before.
Gotcha.
But yeah, all the
And
argument to design says the universe was a product of design. That would be the teleological argument that I would propose.
mhm.
And again, if you see multiverse without any additional evidence for it, you know, that doesn't work when you apply it to the fine-tuned asteroid shower scenario. At least I don't think so. Do you?
I know it's improbable, but I think what you're selling also improbable. Uh,
Okay. Do you
I
think
have
that
two.
in the
Sorry, go ahead.
case of the fine-tuned asteroid shower, do you think the multiverse explanation is a better explanation than the design explanation?
Sorry, repeat that again.
In the fine-tuned asteroid shower, do you think the multiverse explanation is a better explanation than the design explanation?
Yes, if by design you mean a conscious first cause. Yes.
No, no, no. Well, yeah. Okay. So that's where we disagree. It seems to me that if the fine-tuned asteroid shower really did occur, my intuitions tell me that this would be overwhelming evidence for design. That this is clearly a better explanation than the multiverse hypothesis, and your intuitive perceptions differ in that regard.
Gotcha. I have just questions for you at this point, and listen, it's really late, and I know I've had you a long time, just so I could prepare for next time, if there's a next time. I'm not saying there will be, but you were saying like that's not epistemic or metaphysical probability. I'm confused. Can you say what you mean by epistemic probability and then metaphysical probability? Or we'll
Okay.
watch
Yeah.
this and then think about it.
Probability having to do with evidential relations. So an example would be, think back to the fine-tuned asteroid shower example. Now, one could say that this is a product of metaphysical necessity. So in the terms of physical or metaphysical probability, the probability is 100%. But then there's epistemic probability. given that there is no designer of the universe, what is the epistemic probability that we would find this meteor shower text? So the epistemic probability seems relatively low. So whenever we make probability judgments, we're making, think of like science, for example. We have like propositional evidence. We have these observational facts. What is the probability that quarks exist given these given that these propositions are true about what we've observed? Well, the probability is very high. That's what epistemic probability is, the probability of propositions given other propositions, basically. And so what is the probability, given if the universe was not a product of design, that we'd see this fine-tuned meteor shower text? Well, it seems to be extremely low, much lower compared to the probability of what we'd expect if there were a designer. At least that's what it seems to a lot of people, I think. But then you have the problem with epistemic probability is that intuitive perceptions can differ. Think of like a jury trials. Like juries take a look at the evidence and they decide, is he guilty beyond a reasonable doubt? Sometimes the evidence is overwhelming and people's intuitive perceptions say, yeah, I'm looking at this and it seems that given all these facts, it is very likely that the defendant is guilty. But sometimes things might be different. Jurors might look at evidence and say, it's like, I don't think he is guilty. And so epistemic probability judgments, eventually boil down to intuition anyway. I mean, there's the observational facts, obviously.
And was yours
the
epistemic
evidential
or
relations
metaphysical?
between the propositions, that can sometimes be more intuitive in the case of jury trials, for example.
Gotcha. Sorry, and were you using epistemic or metaphysical probability in your argument?
When I talked about, for the teleological argument, the type of coincidence I had in mind was an epistemic coincidence. That's what I explained in my opening statement.
So not a metaphysical probability, right?
Right. That's what I expressly said I wasn't using in my opening statement.
Gotcha. I didn't understand you before, but to me that seems. I already said it. I don't want to repeat myself too much. Like, problem with intuition, like it's a probability, but how do you know if it's actually a probability or actually likely? If you're not looking at the real world, you're kind of stuck in your head. And
whenever we
take
a look at the
delusional. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, think about how we do probability judgments in real life. We have to use, like, given these propositions, what is the likelihood that this is true given that is true? Like, again, scientific evidence, for example. How do we know that these propositions? Well, we just kind of do it the best we can. When we're in jury trials, when we're doing science, we take a look at these propositions. Okay, yeah, it seems that given this evidence, given these propositional evidence, this proposition is probably true. Or like in the fine-tuned meteor shower text, asteroid shower, fine-tuned asteroid shower scenario, a lot of people just intuitively see that, yeah, this seems very likely evidence for design. A lot of it, again, boils down, sometimes we can use statistics, but a lot of times in practice, as within jury trials, we have to use our intuitive perceptions about which propositional truths make a given proposition more likely.
Gotcha.
An example would be, well, here's an example. We accept our intuition that the future will probably relevantly resemble the past. That's an intuition we have to assess that, okay, given this evidence, the sun will probably rise tomorrow, given our experience. That ultimately relies on some intuitions.
I was going to say, what was I going to say? Maybe I'll just move on from this point, but it's like, in science, to determine a probability, an actual probability, because you can have probability in your mind. Like, I imagine this would be likely or not likely, but when you got to get more concrete, you would actually go test it, right? So, is it actually likely? How likely is it? I think that's when you would look at the world.
You would look at the world, but then you would say, okay, given these observational facts that I have observed, how likely is my hypothesis true? And then you're going back to intuition, where you're judging the evidential relations between propositions.
And then once you have that likelihood for the hypothesis, wouldn't you go test the hypothesis to see if it's actually that likely or not?
You can, but remember, in science, there's something called the underdetermination of theories by empirical data. No matter how large a data set of empirical data you have, there's going to be countless number of theories that are empirically consistent with it. So an example would be like, imagine you have a lot of dots, and there's infinitely many lines that you can use to fit through these dots. Now, some of these lines might be elegant and smooth, and some lines may look like spaghetti, but infinitely many lines can fit those dots. It's the same thing with science and empirical data. There's almost infinitely many theories that can be made to fit any empirical data. So how do we judge which theory is more likely? Well, we use intuitions. For example, we rely on our intuition that the future will probably relevantly resemble the past. We think that among empirically indistinguishable theories, nature has this sort of preference between simpler theories over more complex ones, at least all things held constant. So ultimately, we have to rely on intuition to some degree when we say that, given this propositional evidence, this other proposition is probably true.
Yep. Okay. Um, so when there's underdetermination, I mean, I guess you can withhold judgment, but you can also like that's what I was saying I think earlier. Like, if I can't confirm it to reality directly or indirectly, then I would just go with the explanation that's most logical and most parsimonious. So I think that's what you're saying, right? Like when there's many explanations, most of them fit the bill. You're just going with what assumes less and with that which is more consistent, right?
Well, yeah, all
More
else held
simple.
constant, all other factors held constant, we accept the intuition that nature prefers simpler theories over more complex ones among
Gotcha.
the empirically indistinguishable theories. Now, I think that intuition is true, but still, it's really quite remarkable that we kind of know that nature operates this way. It's yeah, very akin to saying that we know that the future will probably relevantly resemble the past. We don't believe in it on the basis of an argument; it just seems true to us. And the fact that we have these little bits of intuitive knowledge is itself quite remarkable. And I suppose you could use an I mean, some theists have used that as an argument for God's sakes. That gets us too far afield. At the end of the day, we're going to have to rely on non-sensory intuition to some degree to be able to make inferences.
Gotcha. I have a question. By the way, if you're getting too tired and you're like, man, I want to go to sleep or go to something else, you could do that, and I'll go do something else, I guess.
Yeah, eventually I
Uh,
have to go to bed here soon, but I could stay for like maybe 7 more minutes.
okay. 3 hours. Okay. The whole conversation. Okay. If you can totally think this analogy is weak or totally disanalogous to what our conversation was like, but I just want you to answer the question, and then you can answer however you want. But like, if we saw a footprint on the floor, um, and I said that, I think the footprint came from like a giraffe, and you're like, yeah, but that's kind of an exotic option. And I'm like, yeah, but you're saying that the footprint came from like a goblin. That's even more exotic. I've never seen a goblin. You've never seen a goblin, but we have seen giraffes. Um, do you think that the giraffe explanation is more likely than the goblin explanation? Yes or no?
Yeah, it would be more likely, and that actually deals quite nicely to the moral argument I had. That given atheism, it's unlikely that moral wrongness exists. Why? Well, it's because given atheism, moral wrongness is a very strange thing, invisible, non-physical, empirically undetectable. We need something like supernatural clairvoyance to detect it. And yeah, that actually dovetails very nicely with the moral argument.
I'll look into that.
Oddly
I don't.
enough.
I'll look into that. Um, and then here's my final question. So we look at the universe, right? And then we see conscious things making order. So, it could build intuitions like, yeah, well, if there's conscious things, it'll build orderly things. At the same time, if you look at nature, you can also see unconscious things doing order. So it can also build the opposite intuition. So my question for you would be this: um, wouldn't then it matter what you assume to begin with? Like if you assume that the first cause is conscious, then you would go with the explanation that conscious things do order. There's order, therefore there's consciousness as the first cause. But if you assume to begin with that the first cause is unconscious, wouldn't you take the opposite approach? Well, unconscious things do order. There's order, therefore the first cause must be unconscious. It kind of seems that how you start really determines how you end. Sorry, go
Well,
ahead.
it's the idea that this unconscious stuff is producing order is a bit question begging because one idea behind the design explanation is that the reason why these supposedly unconscious things are producing order is because this algorithm structure was produced by a mind in the first place. But at the end, the deductive argument that I put doesn't, technically speaking, use an inference to the best explanation type of argument. It just notes that, if God does not exist, then this software like order is just a happy coincidence, which it would be from an epistemic standpoint. And then its beautiful point would be like, okay, well, is it just a happy coincidence? Epistemically speaking, out of the numerous ways the universe could conceivably have been like, our universe happens to be one, a software universe instead of randomized hard drive one.
Gotcha. I don't have
But if we
any.
if we were to do the inference of the best explanation route, then we'd go by like use the fine tuned meteor shower scenario exactly, saying like, well, it just happens to be that way, or it's metaphysically necessary, or a multiverse explanation. And none of those really seem to address the point of epistemic probability, which I think kind of applies in the case of the fact that we live in a software universe.
Gotcha. I don't have any more questions. I will rewatch this just to see if I can learn something. I'm sorry if I was like too obnoxious or something. I'm just actually trying to learn.
No, that's fine. I don't think you were obnoxious.
Yeah. No, I'm actually trying to learn. I know some people argue like to win, which that's not necessarily bad because you could just have two people debate, see who makes the best case. You could change your mind later. But I try to like learn in the moment. But I don't think I could do that. I think I have to go
Okay.
back and learn.
So as
So
we
I
close,
appreciate
I
your
just like
time.
to kind of clarify some points of disagreement with respect to the fine-tuned meteor shower scenario. It seems to me that the multiverse is an inferior explanation to design, and you disagree. And with respect to what moral wrongness in that Humean sense we described earlier, you're agnostic as to whether that sort of moral wrongness exists. Have
Mhm.
I accurately summarized your position?
I'm sorry, repeat the first one. The second one, yes. The first one, I'm sorry. I'm so tired right now.
Okay. Earlier, we talked about like the fine-tuned asteroid shower scenario.
Yep.
Now, in that situation, I think design would be the best explanation, and you think that the multiverse would be the best explanation, would be a better explanation than design in that situation.
Uh, I think that there's better explanations in design. That would be either the multiverse explanation combined with survivorship bias, or just an unconscious first cause
I'm talking
by,
about specifically the fine-tuned asteroid shower scenario.
yeah,
So does you don't think design would be the best explanation in that specific scenario? Is that correct?
it would not be the best. It would not be the best based on two reasons: multiverse and just nature sometimes does actually act orderly. But you had objections to that as well. Like, yeah,
Yeah,
but
I was just trying to accurately. I'm not going to object. I'm not going to respond to those objections. Got to like just identifying where we disagree, and
sorry, yeah, yeah.
and then we also disagree. And then there's as far as the moral argument, you're agnostic as to whether the moral wrongness, in the sense that the argument uses it, exists. Right? You're agnostic about it.
I haven't really formulated my argument, my morality well yet, but I could see it being descriptive solely or descriptive and prescriptive. I can see it being both ways. I'm agnostic.
But about the human, the Humean ought is that type of ought that does not have only descriptive qualities. You're agnostic as to
Correct.
whether that sort of ought. Okay.
Yeah, I could
All right.
totally see that being possible.
So, all right. I'll just leave it there. So, and then this is 3 hour. Yeah, it's went a bit longer than I had planned. But yes, this is Maverick Christian inviting you to go in peace, serve the Lord, and love logic.